Hey, what's up? It's Cute What If. This side. Today we will be seeing what if Deku became the vigilante hero. Before we move ahead with the FIC, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for future what ifs like this. Izuku muttered that he was at it again, swearing under his breath. His mother scolded him for cursing, and he apologized, correcting himself to a cheerful good morning. She glared but allowed the correction, reminding him to watch his words. Over the past few years, he had developed a bad habit of saying whatever came to mind. It had started around 4th grade when he picked up colorful language from Kaken. Teachers were surprised he had been a good kid, and his mother had even pulled him out of school, believing a change of environment would fix his habit. Instead, discovering the internet at 10 had only made things worse. 5 years later, nothing had changed. He did not attend school, he did not see Kaken anymore, and he rarely left the house by choice. He could not keep his mouth shut, and that tendency dragged him into trouble more often than not. When his mother pressed him about it, he insisted he was working on it, and she reminded him that he had claimed that for years. He shrugged and headed for the door, announcing that he would be back before dinner. His mother gave him a small smile and told him to be careful. He climbed to the rooftops using his quirk and scanned the city for trouble. His quirk combined his parents' abilities, telekinesis from his mother and fire breathing from his father. He could lift and move things with his mind and produce flame with more power and control than either of his parents. Where his mother could pull small objects and his father could only manage a small flame without coughing, Izuku could manipulate people-sized objects and produce substantial fire. He had learned those limits the hard way. From the rooftops he spotted Endeavor. Izuku grinned and leaped down to land beside the pro-hero. He greeted Endeavor casually. The hero barely flinched and muttered an insult. Izuku reminded him that the public still saw him as a savior. He teased Endeavor that life would be boring without him, dodging a punch that the hero sent his way. Endeavor shouted and sent a blast of fire. Izuku rolled aside and used telekinesis to toss dirt into the hero's eyes to buy himself space. He smirked at the brief desperation on Endeavor's face. He was about to leave when a huge explosion caught his attention. He ran toward the sound and found a crowd gathered near a strange dark green sludge that burned with flames. From a rooftop vantage, he saw a child about his age trapped inside the viscous mass. Down on the street, pro-heroes were holding the crowd back but not acting to help. Izuku called out and demanded action. The heroes explained they were waiting for backup because their quirks were not suited for this situation. He dismissed that excuse and ran into the fray. Focusing his telekinesis, Izuku reached into the sludge and pulled the child free, tossing them toward the pro-heroes so they could catch them. The sludge entity shouted in surprise, and Izuku pulled his mask down. He expelled a controlled burst of flame that destabilized the sludge and neutralized the threat without graphic detail, then contained the remains by sealing them into a bottle he had grabbed. The crowd cheered as the danger was removed and the child was safe. He nodded to the crowd and then confronted the pro-heroes, telling them that was how to handle it. He mocked their claim that their quirks were ill-suited for the situation. Their faces flushed with embarrassment. He had effectively done their job for them, even if it was technically illegal. As he scanned the street for the child he had saved, he noticed Kaken, blonde hair, slouched posture, red eyes, and a permanent scowl. Recognition hit him hard. A nearby poster distracted him for a moment. He muttered under his breath and then turned as someone shouted a crude insult. He flipped the kid off and joked about it before walking away. His mother later met him at the door and demanded to know what he had been thinking. He avoided the question and greeted her instead. She scolded him that he could have died. He replied by pointing out that he had not. She crossed her arms and asked him to promise to be more careful. He sighed and agreed, and she went back into the house. He went upstairs to his room and lay on his bed, replaying the encounter. Seeing Kaken again after so many years felt strange, and the fact that the older boy had not changed at all made him smile inwardly. He suspected Kaken would try to get into UA High. For a moment he thought about UA. He had not considered applying in years. Vigilante work would likely disqualify him if he were recognized. Still, he had not given up on wanting to be a hero. The dream had dimmed over time, but he was already saving people in his own way and becoming someone others could rely on. A hero license would be nice, and it might take the pressure off from pro heroes like Endeavor. He wondered briefly whether Kakin had recognized him. Then he laughed silently at the thought and let his mind drift, planning his next move. As if he could. It's been 5 years, he probably did not remember who I was, and as much as that thought saddened me, I thought it might be better if he did. I climbed out my window onto the roof and headed toward the city. Aizawa found the vigilante increasingly frustrating. The man did good and helped out when he could, but he was a nuisance. They knew nothing about him besides what appeared to be his quirk. Aizawa had met him a few times and saw nothing inherently wrong with his actions, but the vigilante's methods made heroes look bad, and that made him a threat. He seemed to know everything about every hero, their quirks, their weaknesses, how to beat them, even their names. He called Endeavor NG just to needle him. Everyone knew Endeavor's real name, but no one was brave enough to use it except for this one vigilante. Tsukachi walked past Aizawa's office and told him he was heading out. Aizawa nodded and decided to go on patrol himself, since he would not get any leads on the vigilante sitting in his office. Patrol brought nothing more serious than petty thieves. After a few minutes of scaling roofs, Aizawa spotted someone perched on a rooftop with smoke drifting from his mouth. That could not be good. Aizawa headed closer to get a better look. The figure was plain-looking, around 15 or 16 years old, with bushy green hair dark at the roots. He sat with something smoldering in his mouth. Aizawa called out to ask what the young man was doing. The boy looked him up and down, then turned away as if Aizawa had not been there. The boy addressed Aizawa by name as if they were old acquaintances. Aizawa repeated his own name in surprise. The boy straightened and then cursed under his breath. He pulled something from his pocket and put it on his face before standing to face Aizawa. The vigilante told Aizawa there was no time and introduced himself as Deku for now, adding that he was tired of Endeavor calling him something harsh. He then laughed. Deku warned Aizawa that he should consider himself lucky. Not only was Aizawa the first to know his name, he was the first to get close to capturing him. The realization hit Aizawa. The man he had been hunting for months stood right in front of him. Aizawa began to move toward him when Deku blew smoke into his eyes. Aizawa instinctively rubbed his eyes to clear them. Deku muttered that it had been a bit much and then ran off. Once the smoke cleared, Aizawa reached into his pocket for eye drops and murmured that Deku had given his name away. Deku had been too close. He felt guilty about the amount of smoke he had put in the man's eyes, but he told himself it was the man's fault for not wearing goggles. All he could do now was hope Aizawa had not gotten a good look at his face in the dark. He climbed back into his room through his window. He wondered whether what he had done to Aizawa was self-defense. Most of his fights were defensive, like the one with Endeavor earlier that day. If what had happened with Aizawa did not count as self-defense, then the only real offense he could claim was blowing smoke into a man's eyes. Coughing reminded him of the drawbacks of using his quirks. He had overexerted himself that day to take care of a slime creature, and when he pushed his fire breath too far he started coughing up smoke. He knew his quirks were strong, but pushing them past their limits caused consequences. He could do powerful things, even set a building ablaze if he pushed himself, but sustained attacks were difficult and took a toll. His telekinesis left him with intense headaches when overused, though he had built tolerance over time. His coughing continued until his mother heard him and ran upstairs. She checked on him, guided him out of the smoky room, and sat with him while his coughing fit subsided. After about 10 minutes he began to feel better. His mother remarked that it had been worse than before, and he explained that he had used his abilities more than usual to handle the slime. She told him to be more careful, and he reassured her that he would try. The next day at work, Yamahata burst into Aizawa's office and proclaimed that he had heard Aizawa had run into the vigilante the previous night. Aizawa did not look up from his computer and confirmed that he had. When Yamahata pressed him for details, Aizawa sighed and explained that he had met the vigilante by accident. The young man had been on a roof and Aizawa had thought he was smoking. I told Yamahata that the man had given his name and then blown smoke in my eyes before running off, then I turned back to the computer. Yamahata asked whether it was the man's real name or a code name. I said it was a code name. The room went silent. Yamahata demanded the name. I told him to stop yelling and said the name was Deku, unplugging my ears. Yamahata repeated Deku and asked if I was sure. I confirmed. He sighed and leaned back, commenting that it was a strange name and that, from what he'd heard, the man seemed anything but a Deku. I suggested there was probably a backstory and ended the topic. Yamahata asked if I had my eyes checked. I said the burning went away after a minute. He went quiet and then asked what I thought about Deku. I grumbled that he was full of questions, and finally said Deku was interesting, not doing anything wrong besides using his quirk without a license, and seemed to have good intentions. I remembered that before I approached Deku I had thought he was a teenager. I jumped out of my seat, startling Yamahata and making him fall from his chair. He looked up and asked what was wrong. I explained that when I first saw Deku I thought he was a teenager. When Deku saw me he put his mask on and I had forgotten, so that might mean he was just a teenager. Yamahata stared for a moment and swore. I said I had to tell Nizu about this. He agreed and I grabbed him by the ear and insisted he was coming with me. He protested, but I dragged him along. The alarm clock began to beep. I used my telekinesis to smack it into the wall. I hated mornings. When I checked my phone and saw the time, I realized I also hated afternoons. I set the phone aside, got out of bed, rubbed the sleep from my eyes, and looked around at the gray ash covering my room. I complained that I had just cleaned a few days ago, then cleaned the room. With nothing else to do, I decided to go on patrol. I found my costume and mask. I had not been wearing the outfit lately out of laziness, but I had worked hard to make it and could not let that effort go to waste. The suit was black with red cuffs, white stripes, and a hood. The sleeves were cut short to avoid catching fire. The mask covered the bottom half of my face, and my shoes were bright red with black laces. I put the suit on and hopped out my window. I only wanted to patrol, but instead I got chased. Aizawa called for me to stop from a few feet behind. I yelled back that I would pass on his offer. The chase continued a bit before I used my telekinesis to lift myself up onto the roofs. There I saw Present Mike and muttered an expletive under my breath. He laughed and called out to me as he ran toward me. When he got close enough, I blew a wall of smoke at him and he fell to the ground coughing. As before, I considered it not my fault. He had come to me. When I turned, Aizawa stood there blocking my escape. I grumbled at the two of them being the Wonder Duo. Aizawa told me not to call them that. He wrapped his scarf around me to restrain me. I teased him and told him life was short and to smile while he still had teeth. He reminded me that he had just arrested me. I shrugged and said whatever floats your boat. He remained firm, and the situation settled down without injury. Later, a discussion took place with Principal Nizu about my future. I asked whether they wanted me to enroll at UA and join the hero course in Class 1. Nizu nodded and sipped his tea, confirming the offer. I said the opportunity was something thousands would do anything for. When I asked about other options, Aizawa narrowed his eyes and reminded me that this was a rare chance and questioned why I would ask for alternatives. I explained that although I was grateful, I was not good with people and had not been in school since I was around 9 or 10. Aizawa asked why. I replied that I had been a decent kid when younger, but my mother and teachers considered my best friend a bad influence and my mother had pulled me out. Aizawa suggested she could have moved me to another school. I laughed and explained that nothing really changed and that I had developed a colorful vocabulary early on. Nizu proposed that if things did not work out in the hero class, I could take the hero license exam later. I accepted without hesitation. I stood to leave and asked if I could continue my vigilante work. Nizu said he did not see why not and agreed to try to keep the heroes, specifically Endeavor, from bothering me. I nodded and walked out with Aizawa following. I told Aizawa that this was where we would part ways. He said he needed to inform my parent or guardian. I offered to tell my mother, but he declined. I muttered that she probably would not believe him anyway. At home, I opened the door with Aizawa behind me and called for my mother. She replied that she would be there in a second. I walked into the kitchen with Aizawa following, and after a minute she appeared. She began to ask how patrol had been, then stopped when she saw Aizawa. Midoriya's mother looked at the visitor and then at Aizawa, her face paling slightly as she asked her son who the man was. The visitor told her to calm down and that he was not in trouble as he took a seat at the table. Aizawa, standing behind him, reminded them that he had not forgiven the visitor for a smoke trick from earlier. The visitor dismissed the remark. Aizawa stepped forward and introduced himself to Midoriya's mother, extending a hand. She answered yes when asked if she was Midoriya's mother but did not take the offered hand. Aizawa explained that her son had been offered admission to UA High School, specifically to the hero course, and acknowledged that they were aware of his coarse vocabulary and the fact that he had not been in school for about 5 years, yet emphasized that they saw potential in him as a hero. The visitor added that he could still pursue his vigilante interests on the side, calling it a win for everyone. Midoriya's mother broke into a relieved smile and said it was about time he got out of the house. Midoriya protested that she was the one keeping him there. Outside, Midoriya asked about the large door, and someone nearby admonished his language. Aizawa rolled his eyes and instructed him to wait outside until called in, noting that school had started for that class 2 weeks earlier. Midoriya expressed surprise, and Aizawa entered without answering. In the classroom, the teacher asked everyone to be quiet and take their seats. He then announced that a new student would be joining them that day and warned the class that the newcomer had not spent time with peers for 5 years and had an interesting vocabulary. He invited the new student to enter. Midoriya walked in, glaring at the teacher and letting it be known that he had heard the warning. He scanned the room, then smiled when his gaze settled on a sleeping blonde at one of the desks. He went over and stood in front of that desk. Midoriya walked up to the sleeping student and gave him a light tap on the head to wake him, urging him to get up in a teasing tone. The class fell silent. Midoriya did not mind he had been waiting for this moment for 5 years. The blonde looked up, clearly annoyed and beginning to protest, but then his expression softened as recognition dawned. He could hardly believe it and, overcome with relief, rose and embraced Midoriya. The reunion changed the mood in the room and set the tone for what came next. He paused, broke out of the hug and looked at him. Bakugo demanded to know what Midoriya was doing there. Midoriya told Bakugo that he had missed him too. Aizawa cleared his throat, looking annoyed, and asked Midoriya to introduce himself to the class and explain why he was there. Midoriya walked back to the front and stood beside Aizawa. Midoriya introduced himself as Midoriya Izuku and said he had been recommended by the principal. Aizawa nudged him with an elbow and told him to stop playing around. Midoriya asked the class if they had heard about the vigilante who picked fights with heroes and saved people at the same time. Practically the whole class nodded. Midoriya expressed surprise and told Aizawa he had thought only a few people knew about him. The class responded with loud surprise. Aizawa told the class to calm down and confirmed that Midoriya was the vigilante known as Deku, that Aizawa had apprehended him, and that Midoriya had used his quirk without a license though he had not done anything else wrong. The class reacted with astonishment. Midoriya added that it had technically been self-defense. Aizawa raised an eyebrow, sighed, and said they could discuss it later. He told Midoriya to take a seat. Midoriya smiled and sat down behind Bakugo. Bakugo looked over his shoulder and grinned. Aizawa remarked that literally anywhere else would have been better. Midoriya reminded Aizawa that he had not been in school for 5 years and that Bakugo was the only person he knew and felt comfortable around. Aizawa said he would allow it as long as the two of them did not cause trouble. When Aizawa turned and wrapped himself in his sleep bag, Bakugo spun in his chair to face Midoriya and warned him not to make promises he could not keep. Midoriya responded in kind. Bakugo insisted he could keep his promises. Midoriya asked sarcastically for one promise Bakugo had actually kept. Bakugo replied that he had been staying out of trouble, without looking back. Midoriya smiled and joked that he was glad Bakugo had taken his words to heart. Bakugo told him to shut up. The rest of the class stared, and Midoriya reassured them that he did not bite. Tenya Ida, the blue-haired student with mechanical-looking legs, walked over and introduced himself, offering his hand. Midoriya took the hand and shook it slowly. Other class members came up and introduced themselves, and then the questions began. Students asked whether he was really the vigilante. Midoriya confirmed that he was. When they asked why he had become a vigilante, Midoriya said he had not had anything better to do. They asked what his quirk was, and Midoriya replied that it was confidential. The room went quiet. Midoriya explained that he did not like telling people he had just met what his quirk was, because one of them could be a villain. Someone conceded that it made sense. Midoriya added that, if it made them feel any better, the principal did not know either. A student expressed surprise that the principal could not know, and Midoriya answered with a light-hearted boast that he was just unusually confident. The class looked at him blankly and then laughed when he said they would get used to him. One student admonished that swearing was not something a hero in training should be proud of and told Midoriya and Bakugo to correct the habit. Midoriya pretended to consider the criticism and said he was trying to see things from that student's point of view but was having trouble doing so. The student's face flushed. Midoriya stood, patted him on the shoulder, and said he hoped they could become friends. The student nodded stiffly. Midoriya added, jokingly, that the lack of swearing made him a little uncomfortable, which made the class laugh. Aizawa told Midoriya to stop. Midoriya patted the student again and sat back down, thinking that this might not be so bad. When the bell rang, the class stood and walked toward the door. Aizawa told Midoriya to stay behind. Bakugo called back a casual farewell as he left, and Midoriya glared at the smile on his face. Aizawa told Midoriya not to pick on Ida too much, saying that Ida was a good kid. Midoriya shrugged and said that if Ida got upset over a few swear words, he might not be ready for the real world. Aizawa's lip twitched. Aizawa added that they were going to the USJ for hero training the next day and asked Midoriya to get his hero costume from the support course. Midoriya assumed Aizawa meant Universal Studios Japan and remarked that he knew the school had resources, but Aizawa corrected him and told him he would have to wait and see. Midoriya said he would be on his way. As Midoriya reached the door, Aizawa told him that the kids liked him and needed someone down to earth who did not have their head filled with fantasies. Aizawa asked Midoriya to help them, since they did not know what it was like to risk their lives to save people and were bound to say foolish things. He asked Midoriya to be patient. Midoriya agreed and walked out. At home, Midoriya called that he was home and slipped off his shoes. His mother called back, asking how school had been. Midoriya found her cooking dinner and said the class did not seem so bad. When his mother asked whether he had made any friends, Midoriya said that he had reunited with an old one and smiled. His mother halted, turned to face him, and reacted with surprise and disbelief at the news. Midoriya confirmed that Bakugo was in the hero course and that he had not changed much. She did not say anything and returned to cooking. He sighed and told his mother that if anything, this time he would be the bad example. She responded with a thoughtful hum. He insisted that Katsuki was not a bad person. She sighed and said that she knew. He got up and went upstairs to his room. She had never explained why she disliked his friendship with Katsuki, but he could guess. It was because Katsuki had changed her sweet, kind son into what he was now. He knew she loved him, but he also knew she wished he had never changed. She wished he would stop doing vigilante work, but when she saw how happy it made him, she let it slide. She wished he would swear less. She prayed that he would make new friends. She wondered if their father being alive would have made things different. She wanted her old son back, and he could not bring him back. Midoriya said he was all right before walking out. He wondered if he had said too much. Based on what he knew about Midoriya and the way he acted, Midoriya thought he was a bad influence, someone kids in the hero course should not be around. He thought the opposite. What Midoriya had said about Ida was true. Most kids probably believed that heroes should not swear so openly. Still, many pros swore in combat, not during interviews. He could not count how often he had heard All Might swear during a fight. Midoriya and Bakugo had likely learned some time ago that heroes were not perfect. He sighed, grabbed some papers from his desk, and left the room. He entered his house, sat on the couch, and stared at the ceiling. He could not figure Midoriya out. Midoriya was a good kid, that much he was sure of, but he was like a puzzle with a million pieces, and he hated puzzles. He did not even know what Midoriya's quirk was. Midoriya had said that he was new and did not like telling people he had just met what his quirk was, since one of them could be a villain. That was the thing, Midoriya did not let his guard down. He acted carefree and like he had no problems, but something was clearly bothering him. As for what it was, he had no clue. He was bored on the way to a theme park event that billed itself as Universal Studios Japan. Everyone else was excited about new costumes, but his was the same, which suited him fine. People from the support course had messed with it, but he did not plan to wear it all the time. In an emergency, he would not worry about what he was wearing. If he needed a support item in the future, he guessed he would have to wear them more often. A girl with a frog quirk called Midoriya's name from the seat beside him. Midoriya responded that he was listening. The girl explained that she always spoke her mind and asked him a question. Midoriya agreed to listen. The girl asked, based on videos she had seen on the internet, whether it was true that he had 2 quirks. The whole bus fell silent. Midoriya seemed surprised that there were videos of him online. An uproar followed, with classmates shouting and demanding answers. The chaos continued for a minute until Aizawa told them to be quiet. He knew he was avoiding the question. He was aware they'd find out eventually. For now, he preferred keeping them guessing. For the rest of the ride, everyone stared at him. The only one who did not was Kaken. Kaken already knew what his quirks were. He believed Kaken was at least a little jealous either of the quirks themselves or simply that he had 2 when Kaken did not. When they arrived, he hopped off the bus and followed the rest of the class inside. Looking around, he remarked that the place did not exactly look like Universal Studios Japan. Aizawa rolled his eyes. Uraraka spotted a cosplayer dressed as 13 and whispered excitedly. He asked Uraraka if she liked her, and she said she loved her work, smiling in a way that almost dazzled him. 13 began explaining something, but he was not paying attention. He was focused on a huge portal that had just appeared. He noticed what looked like fake villains emerging from the portal, which struck him as odd. He wondered aloud what sort of place produced fake villains who came out of a massive portal armed with weapons. Aizawa warned him that this was not the time for sarcasm and took a fighting position. He responded by saying that if Aizawa did not want sarcasm, he should not say something that invited it, and he assumed a fighting stance as well. Aizawa asked what he thought he was doing. He pulled his mask over his face and said he was helping. Aizawa ordered him to stay with the class. He refused. A man covered in hands announced that they had come for one thing and one thing only, All Might. He lowered his stance slightly, confused, and asked what he meant. The man asked what he meant by asking what he meant. He stared at the man and asked why anyone would think All Might was there. The arena fell silent. Aizawa whispered that All Might had been hired as a teacher at UA that year. I gaped and whispered back that he had hired All Might. I had never been a huge fan of All Might, but everyone called him the symbol of peace, and I had no desire to start a fight with him. Facing him would be frightening. I imagined I could land a hit and he would only smile. The thought of that smiling face was unnerving. I understood his whole, save people with a smile approach, but it still unsettled me. When I thought of All Might, teacher was the last thing that came to mind. As far as I knew, he didn't have the usual credentials, and if anything he seemed like a poor example for students, always urging them to push past their limits. I had been there, done that, and it had not ended well. The man with the strange hands scratched his neck, and a figure of purple mist materialized beside him. They spoke briefly before a purple portal opened beneath me and several other students. The next moment I was falling toward water. Using my telekinesis, I stopped myself just as I was about to hit the surface and looked around to find a boat nearby. I checked whether anyone else had been transported there. I saw Mineta and Tsu moving toward the boat, so I used telekinesis to lift them out of the water and set them down on the deck. Tsu asked if that had been my quirk, and I confirmed that it was, though I didn't see how that detail mattered in the moment. Mineta broke down in tears. I awkwardly patted him on the back to reassure him. He stared at me in disbelief. He could be an annoying pervert, but this situation was terrifying for all of us. None of us expected to be attacked by villains today. I told them we should get off the boat, and they nodded. I used my power to lift the 3 of us onto land. We landed alarmingly close to the man with the hands and a grotesque, mutant bird-like creature. The other 2 ducked behind a rock. I stood and stared. The man with the hands looked familiar in the worst way, like a name I'd heard too often when gathering information as a vigilante. People had been talking about a new group forming called the League of Villains. The name wasn't creative, but the warnings had been constant. I recognized him as Shigaraki Tamura because people had described the leader of the league as someone who always looked like he needed chapstick. The description fit. I called out to him, asking him to remove his hand from his face for a moment. He turned but kept the hand where it was and snapped at me to be quiet. Then he ordered the Nomu to bring me to him, and the creature started running toward us. That was not good. I had to think fast. I didn't know the full extent of the Nomu's abilities, only that it was terrifying and relentless. I began to dodge its attacks. Its strikes were slow at first, then became faster and harder to avoid. I evaded them for a while, searching for an opening. A plan finally formed. I stepped back, took a deep breath, and unleashed flames at the Nomu, aiming for a vulnerable spot on its head. Shigaraki laughed, warning that the Nomu had regeneration and was as strong as All Might, and that my attacks would be useless. He taunted me as I pushed through the burn in my throat and continued my assault. The Nomu screamed a sound that echoed in a way that felt too human. I wanted to stop, but if the creature had once been human, it surely would not have wanted to remain a puppet of Shigaraki. My assault continued until the Nomu collapsed and stopped moving. Shigaraki muttered something about a cheater and resumed scratching his neck. Before I could take relief in that, a coughing fit seized me. Smoke poured from my mouth and nose and I struggled to breathe. Voices sounded distant. For a brief, odd moment I made a dark joke about telling my kids about this near-death experience, then the reality of not being able to breathe fully set in. I hoped it was only temporary. A short neutral moment passed as others moved in to respond to the situation. Bakugo later recalled how he had fallen through a hole and been trapped with a boy with messy hair in a building full of villains. They had fought and managed to escape and then began searching for other students. That was when he saw me, spewing fire at the bird-like Nomo for several minutes. The sight reminded him of when we were younger and I first manifested a quirk. Smoke had started coming from my mouth while we played outside, and instead of being excited like he had been, I panicked and ran to my mother and began to cough. He had thought it was amazing at the time, and later that week I developed telekinesis, which helped me gain better control. He remembered being proud that we had become friends. He had gotten his quirk a month later and had been told constantly that he would be a great hero someday, while nobody had told me anything like that. That did not stop him from being friends with me. We were going to be a team, the best heroes anyone had ever seen. That was until his mom pulled him out of school 2 years later and all contact was gone. Whenever I asked my mother about Deku, she said that he and his mom were out of town. I thought she was lying. I waited 5 years to see him again. 5 years to see my best friend. And here he was, risking his life to save others. Our parents and teachers blamed me for him changing, but he never did. His goals never changed. He wanted to be someone people could rely on, someone who made others feel safe. I, on the other hand, wanted to be number one and surpass All Might. We had very different goals. I had been zoning out a little, but screams pulled me back into the present. A creature fell to its knees, crying out. I saw Deku a few feet away, terror written across his face. I whispered that it was disgusting, and the student nicknamed Shitty Hair nodded in agreement. The creature stopped crying and Deku stood panting, smoke trailing from his mouth and nose. He stayed still for a moment before doubling over, coughing and gasping for air. I yelled Deku's name and started running toward him. He looked in my direction, then his eyes rolled back and he passed out. I caught him seconds before he hit the ground. Thin wisps of smoke still curled from his nose and mouth. I picked him up and started running toward the entrance when Mistman stepped in front of me and blocked the way. I ordered him roughly to move. A voice behind me said that I could not take Deku away. I turned and saw a man covered in hands scratching his neck and looking at me with crazy red eyes. The man said that Deku had cheated and that he would pay for it. I glared at the man and told him that Deku was not going to pay for anything. The man taunted me about my temper. Then gunshots cracked through the air and the man covered in hands crumpled to the ground. Pro heroes had finally arrived, including All Might. Instead of celebrating like the others, I stared at them. Still carrying Deku, I walked up to the heroes and told them it had taken them too long. Sonic told me that the heroes had saved them and that I should show more respect. I replied that Deku had saved us. While the pros had been taking their sweet time to get here, Deku had been out there risking his life for everyone. I walked out of the USJ with Deku to find police and an ambulance waiting. I ran to the ambulance. They put Deku on a stretcher and loaded him into the vehicle. I watched as they drove away. Slowly, I reached into my pocket for my phone, checked for a signal, and dialed the emergency number Deku had given me. After a few rings, Deku's mother, Inko, answered. She told me she hoped Deku would be okay. Across the city, Tamura Shigaraki watched the events unfold and raged. He threw a bar stool in anger, and the screen in front of him told him not to take his anger out on furniture. He muttered an apology to his mentor. He swore that everything had been ruined and that the boy and his angry friend had cheated fate. He refused to believe that a Nomu could have been defeated by a teenager and vowed to get his revenge. I woke up some time later in a room that looked more like a classroom than a hospital. The only differences were a few eye charts, cabinets, beds, and an older woman with a cane seated nearby. She said that I was awake. I muttered a quiet response. The woman told me that I had overused my quirk at the USJ. I thought that was obvious. She explained that I had suffered second-degree burns on my throat from the strain. I asked in surprise, and she reassured me that it should heal in about 2 weeks but that it might leave a scar. I groaned and flopped down on the bed. I asked when I could leave. The nurse said she wanted me to stay another day, just in case. When I started coughing, she said that was exactly why I needed to stay. A short while later, the nurse informed me that I had a visitor. I told her to let him in. The door opened to reveal a fuming Kaken. She greeted me with a harsh insult, and I responded with one of my own. She marched to the bedside glaring at me and called me an idiot. I returned the remark. She sat down in the chair next to the bed and, after a few moments of tense silence, told me not to do anything that stupid again, avoiding eye contact. I laughed and she hit my arm, and I put on a mock surrender. Her lip twitched into a small smile before she sat back. She said, more seriously, that what I had done had been reckless. I apologized. She asked how my throat was. I said it was all right, though it might scar. She joked that the scar would match a pain relief patch, and I told her not to remind me. She stood up and told me she would see me tomorrow. As she headed for the door, I asked if she had called our mother, and she paused before answering. A woman told him that she had visited while he was still unconscious. He nodded. The man opened the door and said she had promised to come again later. He thought she would kill him and decided he would face that when the time came. The nurse told him he was free to leave but warned him to be careful and not to talk too much. He told her he understood, swung his legs off the bed and stretched. The nurse then forbade him from using his quirk for about a month. He reacted with surprise and immediately began to cough harshly. She explained that using his quirk now could further damage his throat and might even risk losing his voice. He only nodded, put on the uniform she had ready, and headed to class. He made a joking remark about the big door as he walked in. All eyes turned to him. He asked if there was something on his face. Kaken, grinning broadly, pointed out that it was his neck. He called Kaken an idiot in return. Kaken responded with a teasing, affectionate comment. The class stared. He walked to his seat behind Katsuki. Aizawa entered a few minutes later and noted that he was back already. He responded that he was asking if Aizawa had missed him. Aizawa ignored the banter and addressed the class. Next week was the sports festival, so they should use the week to train their quirks. Because of what had happened at the USJ, the whole world was watching, and they should not be surprised if other students' attitudes toward them had changed. He muttered that they had almost died and now everyone was jealous. The classmates who heard him nodded in agreement. When the bell rang, he celebrated that school was over. A few classmates came over to his desk and invited him and Bakugu to train with them. He stood and declined with a ridiculous excuse about having to walk his unicorn. The others were confused as he left. Kaken asked what kind of excuse that had been. He shrugged and said that he was often as surprised as everyone else by what came out of his mouth. Later, in Kaken's room, Kaken set his bag down and asked if the old woman had told him he couldn't use his fire quirk for a month. He confirmed that was right. Kaken commented that the sports festival was next week. He repeated that he understood. Kaken wondered if he was just going to rely on his telekinesis. He turned to face Kaken and said that, as much as he would like to show everyone what his fire could do, he actually cared about his voice. He added that he wanted to compete against Kaken at his best, not when he was holding back. Kaken argued that this felt like half-heartedness. He explained he had no intention of using his fire quirk in their likely fight. When Kaken asked why, he shrugged and said he saw no point in matching fire with fire. Kaken thought it over for a moment and slowly agreed. He lay back on Kaken's bed and mumbled that the whole situation's still sassy. Kaken agreed. They sat in silence for a minute until he shouted that it was boring. Kaken rolled his eyes. He begged to do something, anything. An impish grin crossed Kaken's face, but Kaken immediately refused what he was thinking. He reminded him that he had said anything, and Kaken clarified that anything except that. Kaken yanked him off the bed and dragged him out the door. Kaken laughed that it brought back memories. He said he hated him. Kaken told him to be quiet and insisted he had missed it, but he denied it. Kaken asked what else they could do. He suggested taking his imaginary unicorn for a walk, and Kaken laughed before dragging him into the arcade. Katsuki had taken him to the arcade frequently when they were younger because it was one of the few places Katsuki could beat him. He did not hate the arcade for the games themselves. It was the noise, the lights, the crowds, and the overwhelming atmosphere that bothered him. Kaken called his name, using Izuku, and he asked since when Kaken had started calling him that. Kaken teased him, and he said he had no problem with it. Kaken motioned for him to come along. They headed for the worst game in existence, whack-a-mole. He protested. He did not like hitting the plush moles. Kaken used that to his advantage. Kaken put in the tokens and asked if he was ready. Kaken, like an unstoppable force, whacked every mole that popped up with energetic, competitive enthusiasm. He took a gentler approach, playfully tapping the moles as they appeared, and the game machines held up under both of their efforts. When the scores were compared, Kaken feigned surprise at his own victory. He rolled his eyes and dragged his feet after Kaken, saying that Kaken owed him. As they left the arcade and stepped back into the quieter world outside, he declared that they would never do that again. Kaken insisted that he had enjoyed it. He joked about losing 35 times and elbowed him. He playfully smacked Kaken on the shoulder and promised to get his revenge at the sports festival. Kaken laughed. He laughed that I couldn't beat him. I tripped him with my foot and he went down hard on the pavement. I laughed that beating him in the sports festival had given me all the revenge I needed. He stood up, glaring and promising I would pay for it. My laughter turned into a coughing fit. He muttered that I was an idiot. Between coughs I pointed out who had just kissed the ground. He made an obscene gesture in response. As we stepped into his house, Katsuki asked whether I was staying the night or going back. I said I would stay and headed for the couch. He told me I could not avoid Inko forever. I insisted I was not avoiding her. He sat down beside me. I wondered if there was anything wrong with hiding from his mother to avoid being grounded. If anything, I was avoiding consequences, not her. Katsuki reached for the remote and offered to watch last year's sports festival. I agreed. Aizawa announced that the sports festival was the next day and dismissed the class. I stood and stretched, thinking about tomorrow when someone called out that we had company. I pushed through the classroom only to find a crowd blocking our door in the hallway. I asked if they had left class early to visit us and met a wall of hostile stares. A purple-haired student with dark circles under his eyes said they had come to see what the great Class 1A looked like. I answered, amused, and thought about how everyone in my class had earned their place through hard work. Kirishima, Katsuki, Siro, and even Mineta, who had a notorious reputation that made me curious how he had gotten in. The student accused us of being all talk. I listed what we had been through, being attacked by villains, watching our teacher get hurt, nearly dying situations that had put us in the news and drawn attention. I insisted that those standing behind me deserved their spots and had come here because they had goals to pursue, not because they were lucky. The crowd went silent. I sighed and pointed to Katsuki, explaining that Bakugo Katsuki had scored highest on the entrance exam and aimed to be the #1 hero to surpass All Might and prove he was the best. Then I pointed to Uraraka and called her the kindest person I knew. When the question of why she wanted to be a hero came up, I said simply that she wanted money to support her family. The statement provoked an uproar. I heard Uraraka crying behind me. I told everyone to be quiet and continued, noting that Uraraka's ambition was to help her family rather than for selfish reasons. A few people looked uncomfortable. I went on to describe other classmates and their motivations, Ida Tenya wanting to follow in his family's footsteps, Jiro Kyoka wanting to make her parents proud, Kirishima Ijiro wanting to be like his hero, the Crimson Riot, Kaminari Denki wanting others to stop looking down on him, Momo Yaoyorozu wanting to help others, Mina Ishido wanting to save people, Tsu Azui wanting to make a difference, and Shiro Hinata admiring heroes like Spider-Man. I kept my gaze on the purple-haired student the entire time. His expression did not change, and he asked what I wanted to be. That question made me pause. In truth, I had only ended up here because I had been caught. Originally, I had wanted to be like Katsuki. I had become a vigilante because I disliked how some heroes operated, and I still wanted to help people. I told the crowd to move out of our way. When they refused, I used my telekinetic quirk to create a path, gently nudging people toward the walls so we could pass. I walked through and told them they had come, seen, and now should get out of the way. Afterward, Katsuki commented that it had been one hell of a speech. I muttered that it was ridiculous and that they were all just jealous, then wiped a trickle of blood from my nose, a familiar drawback of my quirk. He asked how I had known why the extras wanted to be heroes. I explained that it became obvious if you observed people long enough. He laughed at the idea of observing others. I suggested he start paying more attention to our class because it might come in handy someday. He sneered and called me a nerd. Later, Katsuki called my name and warned me not to half-heartedly perform. I was changing when he told me that if he won, he would take me to the most popular arcade in Japan. I turned toward him in surprise. He grinned and confirmed his offer. Before I could argue, an announcer boomed a welcome to the year's sports festival and introduced Class 1A. I braced myself for the competition to come. Sometimes I wondered how my life had come to this. Getting beaten up was never part of the plan, but at least my classmates believed in me. Their cheers and encouragement showed that the little speech I had given the day before had gotten me on their good side. Well, besides half and half, I really didn't get the guy. One moment he was telling his life story and asking if I was his father's secret love child, and the next he was attacking me like there was no tomorrow. I admitted I felt bad for him. What what Endeavor did to him was unforgivable. But what Todoroki was doing to me in the arena was also unacceptable. I understood that he'd had a tough life, but that didn't justify taking it out on me. Todoroki shouted from the other side of the arena, demanding that Midoriya use his fire. I replied that I couldn't, for the 100th time. He glared and sent another glacier at me. I used my telekinesis to smash it to pieces and told him that this was getting old as I dodged more ice blasts. He told me to shut up. Before this continued, the memory drifted back to an hour earlier, when I was fine and not getting beaten up by Todoroki. The stadium announcer introduced the schools for the sports festival and Nemuri, in her hero costume, took the microphone to speak. She invited the student with the highest entrance exam score to the stage. I knew it wasn't me, since I hadn't taken the exam. The person she meant was Bakugo Katsuki. Bakugo walked to the stage with his usual smug look and declared that he was going to win. The crowd booed and other students reacted, while Class 1A stared in silence. He left the stage satisfied, and I thought he was an idiot. Nemuri then announced that the first challenge would be an obstacle course. Knowing Yue and Principal Nizu, it promised to be more dangerous than it sounded. When the dust settled, I had won. It wasn't a surprise. The expression on Katsuki's face was priceless. Those robots had been excessive and the minefield could have been dangerous. I had used them strategically when someone Katsuki got too close. All's fair, I reminded myself. The next event was the cavalry battle. Katsuki asked if I wanted to team up. I swatted his hand away and called him a creep. He took that as a yes and then tried to leave. I grabbed the collar of his shirt and pulled him back. After my win, people avoided me, so I pulled strings to assemble a team: Bakugo, Tokoyami, Mei and me. Katsuki looked unimpressed as he examined the team. I handed him the team headband and told him to wear it. He refused, grumbling, but Mr. Ida, acting as class president, glared and urged him to put it on. Katsuki snatched the headband out of my hand. I outlined the plan. Katsuki would be the rider since people were intimidated by him and his quirk would be useful, Tokoyami and Mei would be in the back to help with defense. I would be in front to use my quirks effectively. Katsuki muttered about my nickname and I acknowledged that I would be prepared in case Icy Hot targeted us. Nemuri started the countdown. When the race began, everyone rushed forward. I warned my team to hold on, used my telekinesis to lift us off the ground, and Tokoyami asked if anyone could fly up to meet us. I explained that based on the obstacle course, only Uraraka might pose a threat, and she tended to get sick and probably couldn't carry 4 or 5 people anyway. Tokoyami nodded. I asked Mei if her gadgets could keep us aloft. She activated her support boots, and I eased off my telekinesis, grateful to remain in the air. I wiped at a nosebleed and breathed a sigh of relief. Someone shouted from below for us to get down and fight, but I told them I preferred staying above the chaos. Yamahata asked Aizawa over the PA if this was allowed. I refused to climb down into the pit of power-hungry teenagers, and a few laughs rippled through the crowd. Aizawa sighed into the microphone and explained that he saw no problem with what Midoriya's team was doing. They were simply using quirks and gadgets to their advantage. Midoriya thought that with their 100 million point headband, this was probably the only way to keep it safe. Katsuki yelled that they were not strong enough to fight those extras. Midoriya told Katsuki to be quiet and clarified that was not what was meant. Katsuki refused to be told what to do. Nemuri announced that 2 minutes remained. Mei asked Midoriya if he could take over again. Midoriya agreed and used his telekinesis to hold them up. Yamahata shouted that time was up. Midoriya finally lowered them back to the ground. Tokoyami admitted feeling guilty about having cheated a little. Midoriya replied that they had worked smarter, not harder, and let go of Katsuki. Katsuki yelled in outrage at being dropped. Midoriya explained it had been because Katsuki had been a pain earlier. Nemuri began calling out the winners. She announced that in first place it was Team Midoriya with 100 million points. A few students clapped and cheered. Yamahata called a lunch break before the next round. Midoriya followed the other students out of the arena and toward the place where they would eat. Half and Half called Midoriya over. Midoriya asked what he wanted and Half and Half told him to come along. Midoriya recognized that following Half and Half had been a mistake. Midoriya and Todoroki ended up in a hallway, leaning against opposite walls to talk face to face. Katsuki had bet $20 that Todoroki would ask Midoriya out, but Midoriya doubted it. He thought the bet was his. Todoroki brought up Midoriya's quirk. Midoriya acknowledged that their quirks were similar: Todoroki with ice, Midoriya with telekinesis, and noted that Todoroki had not been using his fire during the challenges. Todoroki said he had simply noticed. Midoriya admitted that he could ask Todoroki why he did not use his fire, but he noted that as far as he knew Todoroki had not used it in class either. He then told Todoroki, honestly, that he himself could not use his own fire right now. Todoroki asked why and then, after a pause, asked who Midoriya's father was. Midoriya answered bluntly that he did not have one. Todoroki waited for a response, but when none came he asked one last question. Midoriya urged him to be quick. Todoroki asked what Midoriya thought of Endeavor. Midoriya clarified that Endeavor was Todoroki's father and said that he had fought him on multiple occasions for no reason and would not call himself a fan of the man. Todoroki asked if Midoriya was his secret child or something. Midoriya said he wanted to slap him and interrupted, insisting that he would know if Enji were his father. Todoroki insisted he was only speculating, but Midoriya said the idea was insulting. Todoroki looked blank for a moment. Midoriya explained that he had seen pictures of his own father and that he did not resemble Enji. Todoroki said he thought Midoriya had some connection to Enji, and if that were true it would give Todoroki more reason to defeat him. Midoriya countered that he had asked Principal Nizu to keep that particular man away from him. Todoroki asked if Midoriya knew what quirk marriage was. Midoriya said he had heard of it. Todoroki explained that his parents had been in such an arrangement to combine quirks, that some of his siblings were considered failures by their father, and that Todoroki was treated as the masterpiece, meant to surpass all might. He accused his father of forcing his children to achieve what he could not. Todoroki touched the scar on his face and said it came from a traumatic incident in his childhood. He declared that he refused to be used as a tool and intended to prove he could win without relying on his father's fire. He wanted to win using only his ice. Midoriya, without thinking, told him he was setting himself up for failure. Todoroki shot him a fierce glare and insisted he could not lose if he used only his ice. Midoriya thought the same about himself and turned away. Katsuki called out that Midoriya could come out now. Midoriya said that Todoroki had been very wrong. Walking past Katsuki, Midoriya heard Katsuki ask if he would do anything, like confront Endeavor. A gruff voice interrupted and asked what was being said about him. Midoriya and the others turned to see Endeavor approaching. Midoriya replied that they had only been talking about how Endeavor mistreated his children and had sent his wife away. Endeavor growled for the remark to be repeated and moved toward them. Midoriya told Endeavor that his son was not a reflection of him and that Midoriya himself was not all might. Endeavor laughed and told Midoriya to stop treating his son like an extension of himself. Midoriya tilted his head with a smirk and reminded Endeavor that he should recognize him. Endeavor stared for a moment, then demanded how Midoriya had gotten in and called him a villain. Endeavor laughed and asked why they would let him in, whether they had taken pity. Katsuki muttered that it was more like being forced, and someone snapped at Katsuki to be quiet. The protagonist replied that with heroes these days, who knew, then turned and told Endeavor they would see him around. Katsuki remarked that the protagonist would probably end up against half and half in the next round. The protagonist said it was likely and that they would just wing it. Katsuki muttered about why he bothered with the protagonist as they walked back out into the arena. Midnight resumed the announcements and congratulated everyone who had made it that far before calling for the battle tournament pairings. Ojiro interrupted to request permission to withdraw from the tournament. The arena fell silent as all eyes turned to him. Ojiro explained that he felt he had cheated during the cavalry battle. He did not remember parts of it and believed someone in his group had been manipulating him with a quirk. Continuing would not be fair to the others, so he asked to withdraw. Midnight considered this briefly and granted his request, and Ojiro left. Another student then requested to withdraw as well. A brief pause followed before Midnight moved on to the pairings. A hologram listed the first match as Midoriya Izuku vs. Shinso Hitoshi. Katsuki, sitting beside the protagonist, asked if the protagonist knew who Uraraka was. The protagonist reacted with surprise, then noticed Uraraka staring at Katsuki in shock. The announcer confirmed the match and said it would begin in a few minutes. Ojiro beckoned the protagonist over and asked to speak privately. Ojiro warned that Shinso had been brainwashing their team during the cavalry battle and advised the protagonist not to respond to anything he said. The protagonist thanked him and, when Ojiro asked to have Shinso handled, gave a mock salute and promised to do their best. The protagonist added that they mostly wanted to see what the other student could do. When the match began, the protagonist stepped into the arena and saw Shinso standing on the opposite side. Nemuri counted down and the match began, but neither competitor moved. The stadium watched in silence, waiting for someone to make the first move. The protagonist adopted a casual posture, hands in pockets, trying to appear unconcerned and make a point that this opponent was not a threat. Shinso glared and mirrored the protagonist by putting his hands in his pockets as well. The protagonist recognized that he could end the match instantly with a telekinetic push, but held back for the challenge. Shinso mocked the protagonist, asking if he ought to be somewhere like jail and accusing him of being the vigilante Deku. Aizawa choked on his drink in reaction while the crowd remained hushed. The protagonist slowly nodded in acknowledgement. Shinso pressed further, questioning how someone like the protagonist had gotten into the hero course, and the protagonist joked about the situation to draw some laughs from the audience. Suddenly the protagonist found their body unable to move. They realized that Shinso's quirk required a verbal response to take effect. It was a subtle, infuriating ability that manipulated actions through commands following conversation. Shinso ordered the protagonist to walk out of the arena. The protagonist forced their mind to resist. They refused to be counted as having lost by walking out of bounds, especially after promising Ojiro they would win. Memories of a past fight returned. The protagonist had once faced someone who used a paralyzing quirk and had responded by releasing a concentrated burst of telekinetic energy, a technique they called pulsing. That move had been risky and caused collateral damage, but support heroes were on standby for situations like that. Relying on that memory now, the protagonist summoned the same technique. A surge of telekinetic force cracked the ground and stirred the air. The protagonist roared in triumph as the compulsion broke and they were free. With a grin, the protagonist charged. They struck Shinso, grabbed his arm, and used momentum to toss him over a shoulder and out of bounds. The announcer Yamahata declared that Shinso was out of bounds and that Midoriya had won. Shinso stared in disbelief as the protagonist approached and explained that he had lost because he had relied solely on his quirk instead of trying to actually fight. The other student complimented Midoriya's quirk, but Midoriya interrupted, saying it could only get him so far and warning that next time he should hit him. The student agreed and stood. They shook hands. The student asked if Midoriya was really Deku, and Midoriya affirmed that he was the one and only. The chaos in the arena left the crowd stunned. Midoriya found himself surprised at how far things had gone. He felt bad for Zero. No one deserved that kind of humiliation. It had started when Icy Hot stepped forward with a furious expression. Midoriya could only describe the look as one that made him fear a violent outburst. He had faith in Zero for a couple of minutes when Zero managed to capture Todoroki and began spinning him like a puppet. That confidence dissolved when half the stadium became covered in a sudden sheet of ice, trapping Zero inside it. Midoriya muttered that it was showing off. Nemuri asked Zero if he could move. Zero stammered that he could not move. The announcer declared Todoroki the winner because Zero was unable to move. Midoriya sighed. It looked like he would have to face Todoroki next. He considered dropping out, but the quirk he needed to stand a chance against Todoroki was unusable, leaving him at a disadvantage. He had already made a big impression, so backing out was not an option. The announcer called the next match, Uraraka Achiko vs Bakugo Katsuki. Midoriya asked Katsuki if he had any last words as Katsuki got up. Midoriya said he was rooting for the girl and that she would beat him. Katsuki laughed and said they would see. The crowd reacted with boos and complaints, and some bystanders urged others to stop. Midoriya snapped that Katsuki saw Uraraka as real competition and not an easy win simply because she was a girl. Many in the crowd were pro-hero fans, and Midoriya bristled at their attitude. In his experience as a hero in training, when someone posed a real threat, gender did not factor into his approach. He would act to protect others. The match itself was intense. Uraraka held her ground and landed a few solid hits, but in the end Katsuki won. The crowd fell silent when the victor was announced. Only Midoriya and a few classmates applauded. Midoriya went to check on Uraraka afterwards, not to offer hollow congratulations but to see how she was holding up. He overheard her conversation with her parents and realized she did not need his help. He felt foolish for thinking otherwise and resolved to acknowledge her strength. Returning to the class seating, Denki called out that they had been worried when Midoriya had not shown up with Bakugo. Midoriya explained that he had gone to check on something and asked what he had missed. Zero said that Tetsu and Kirishima were still fighting. Midoriya watched as Kirishima faced an opponent with a similar quirk. The bout had been going on for nearly half an hour. In the end, both fighters passed out, resulting in a tie, and it was decided they would compete again in a different manner when they woke. Other matches followed. Denki lost to a girl from Class 1B after a clumsy attempt to flirt, Momo was pushed out of bounds by Tokoyami, and Ida ended up winning when his opponent walked out of bounds. The announcer then called Todoroki Shoto vs Midoriya Izuku. Midoriya stood and sighed. His classmates offered words of encouragement as he walked away. Denki and Zero cheered that he had this. Midoriya considered his options. He could not use his fire-based quirk, so his telekinesis was the only viable tactic. He planned to try to throw Todoroki out of bounds immediately, and if that failed he would improvise. He knew Todoroki's power made close combat risky, so a quick resolution was his best shot. Midoriya walked into the arena as Todoroki approached from the other side. They met in the center while the referee counted down. When the count reached the start, Midoriya immediately used his telekinesis to try to push Todoroki out of bounds. But just as he was about to cross the line, he used a wall of ice to stop himself. I clicked my tongue and muttered that this might take longer than I thought. He sent multiple blocks of ice my way. I pulsed with telekinesis and shattered them all. He shouted for me to use my fire. I refused. He demanded to know why, and I admitted that I was avoiding my fire because of my dead father. He asked if that was really true, and I confirmed it while using telekinesis to lift the broken pieces of ice and hurl them toward him. One of the pieces hit him and he tried to dodge the rest. I pointed out that he could have avoided being hit by melting that ice with his fire. He told me to shut up. I asked why he could ask about my fire, but I couldn't comment on his, and he sent more ice at me as we traded barbs while fighting. Yamahata, the announcer, asked the audience what Midoriya and Todoroki could possibly be arguing about at a time like this. Aizawa began to answer, but I cut him off by using telekinesis to grab the microphone and send it flying out the window. Yamahata shouted in shock. Aizawa only glared at me. I justified my action to myself. Aizawa had been about to broadcast my quirk to all of Japan, including villains. I knew heroes already dealt with exposure, but I was 15 and had exams and a public sports festival that other schools watched. Now that Shinso had revealed that I was Deku, keeping my quirk secret felt urgent. I got distracted dealing with Aizawa, and Todoroki managed a solid hit. I complained that hitting someone while they were distracted was unfair. He said he was there to win, not to mess with a teacher's microphone. I grabbed him again with telekinesis and, instead of throwing him out, lifted him into the air. I assured anyone who might worry that I would not drop him. That would be a crime with serious consequences. My goal was the same tactic Todoroki had used on Zero: immobilize him to secure a win. Midnight asked whether I could move Todoroki. He muttered that he needed 1 second, created an ice ramp, and slid down it, landing on the opposite side of the arena. I grumbled as he landed and avoided using a different approach for as long as I could. The crowd and classmates started chanting encouragement for me. Todoroki yelled from across the arena for me to use my fire. I yelled back that I could not. He glared and sent another glacier at me. I used telekinesis to disintegrate it into pieces and taunted him, but he kept sending more. I had fought more villains and heroes than I could count, and I refused to lose to him. I resolved to apologize later to my mother and everyone else for keeping a secret, but I could not back down now. I had lied to my mom, to Katsuki, to the class, and even to Todoroki. The truth was that I could breathe fire like my father and had telekinesis like my mother. Combining the two had revealed that I could produce fire from my hands and feet. Since Todoroki insisted on using only ice, I decided to use my fire to my advantage. I put my hands out and told him silently that if he wanted me to use my fire, fine, I would. Todoroki sent another chunk of ice at me. I blew a small breath of fire onto my hands. They ignited into flames, and I held them out to melt the incoming ice. Yamahata announced into the microphone that it seemed I had a trick up my sleeve. I grinned and asked rhetorically if he would just end things and surrender. Todoroki declared he would win using only his right side. I thought about the familiar anime battles where a main character snaps and surprises everyone. I was tired of Todoroki clinging to an excuse when there were people out there who had no quirk at all. Saying I snapped would be an understatement. I lost control of my temper and yelled at him, trying to force him to face what his stubbornness meant. That only provoked him and he kicked me hard. I would have seemed likely to lose, but instead I barely won. We both ended up taking heavy blows. I got the upper hand in the end and managed to knock him out of bounds. Todoroki's unfamiliarity with his fire made his control rough and unpredictable, but I had managed to close the distance and throw him out of bounds. It was a good match, better than any I had had with Endeavor anyway. Bakugo remembered the moment he finally got Todoroki to use his fire. Todoroki had shouted his own name and announced that now that he was past his rebellious phase, they could continue training. Bakugo smirked at the idea of a little rebellious phase that had lasted nearly 10 years. Now Bakugo had a much bigger problem: Midoriya Izuku. After Bakugo combined telekinesis and fire in the match, Midoriya had gone through every emotion in seconds: confused, hurt, angry, and for a brief instant, even looked proud. When Midoriya met Bakugo after the match, he had glared and walked away. Bakugo accepted that he deserved the look. The thought of telling his mother made him uneasy. Midoriya wandered the halls instead of going to the infirmary, since nothing seemed broken. He turned a corner and found Ida Tenya on the phone. Ida had told his mother he would be on his way after hearing something about Tensei, but then he froze and started to cry. Midoriya approached and, after a moment, told Ida that this was not the only sports festival he could participate in and that there would be other years. Ida began to protest but then nodded when Midoriya told him to go see his brother, assuring him that he would tell Aizawa something had come up. Ida thanked Midoriya and ran down the hall. Midoriya walked to the announcement booth and stepped inside. Aizawa and the other pro turned, surprised. Aizawa remarked that it was just Midoriya, and Midoriya took a seat and explained that he had come with bad news. Ida Tenya had urgent business and had to leave. Aizawa relayed the information over the microphone and announced that, due to those issues, Ida Tenya had dropped out and Tokoyami Fumikage would win by default. A few murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd. Aizawa then announced that the next match would be Midoriya Izuku vs Bakugo Katsuki. Bakugo knew he was in trouble. Later, Bakugo replayed what had happened in his head. He had confronted Midoriya about using his fire. Midoriya had surprised him by unleashing flames that melted Todoroki's ice during the match. Bakugo had expected resistance to using fire, but Midoriya had used it decisively. In the dorm, Bakugo told Midoriya that he wanted to beat him at his best, not when he was holding back. Midoriya explained that he had not planned to use his fire quirk against Bakugo, because using fire against someone who also used fire felt pointless. Bakugo pushed back at the idea but eventually nodded. He still resented the fact that Midoriya had not mentioned he could do more than breathe fire. Midoriya lay back on his bed and muttered that it's still SE. Bakugo watched the fight replay in his mind and felt a complicated mixture of irritation and grudging respect. Between matches, other students asked Bakugo why Midoriya, who had taken villains down quickly in some videos, had such trouble against Todoroki. Bakugo explained that fighting villains and fighting classmates were completely different. When Midoriya faced villains, the stakes were life and death. He had no hesitation about using everything he had to protect others. Against classmates, he couldn't risk seriously injuring anyone, and he subconsciously held back. One of the extras put a hand on Bakugo's shoulder and made a theatrical comment about his answer, and Bakugo shoved him away, telling him to get lost. When the announcer declared Midoriya the winner of the previous match, Bakugo glared but stood up. He was not in the mood for excuses. He heard again that Ida had dropped out and that the next match would be Midoriya versus Bakugo. Bakugo laughed under his breath and prepared himself. You know you're in trouble when Bakugo Katsuki looks happy to see you. I walked out into the arena and saw him smiling on the other side. It wasn't the usual cruel smirk, it was more like a, I'm going to kill you politely grin. I felt oddly flattered, despite the danger. I had a plan. It might be a good one, maybe just adequate. I knew that if I refused to fight, Katsuki would lose his temper, so I decided to go along for exactly 10 minutes. It would probably be the longest 10 minutes of my life, but I had accepted the consequences if I lost. More anger, more trouble. I valued my life more than another trip to hell. I would give Katsuki a fair fight for 10 minutes, then make it look like I accidentally stepped out of bounds. He would win and I would live a little longer. I didn't really want to win. Winning would draw too much attention. Being Midoriya was hard enough. The announcer counted down, and the match began with a boom. Bakugo taunted me to use my new fire trick as I dodged. I relied on my telekinesis and used the same approach I had used against Todoroki, but instead of ice I grabbed rubble and debris. I lifted everything I could and hurled it toward Katsuki. He took a few hits and detonated the rest. Bakugo kept demanding that I use my fire, and I muttered that I was getting déjà vu. He told me to shut up and charged toward me with alarming speed. I dodged his attacks and used telekinesis to spin him, attempting to toss him out of the ring, but he stopped himself with explosions. I grumbled in irritation. He pressed, asking why I wouldn't use the new trick on him and what made Icy Hot special. I said that if I used it the fight would be over quickly. He challenged me to bet on it. I accepted, throwing my hands out and shouting that I wanted the bet. His eyes widened, then his face split into a grin as he told me to bring it on. I ignited my hands and formed fire spheres, whipping them toward his shoulders, which were already strained from his huge explosions. I knew it was a ruthless move, but he had asked for it. The spheres struck, and he winced and glared before sending a massive explosion my way. I used debris to build a makeshift wall. It wouldn't stop the blast, but it would slow it enough that it wouldn't be lethal. Bakugo complained that I couldn't give him a little explosion for once, and I replied that where was the fun in that? Then I focused and created a sphere of energy the size of his biggest explosion. The spectators tensed. Aizawa warned over Yamahata's microphone that Midoriya could not use that on Bakugo because it might kill him. I insisted that Bakugo could dodge. I knew the sphere could be fatal if it hit him, and my goal was still to shove him out of the ring. To be safe, I sent the sphere to the ground so the blast would erupt between us. When the smoke cleared, I saw Bakugo standing on the other side. His smile was gone and he stared me dead in the eye. The announcer declared Bakugo Katsuki the winner. I looked down and realized I had stepped out of bounds. A few days after the sports festival, Katsuki still refused to speak to me. During the award ceremony he had been chained to a wall, and All Might had placed the medal in his mouth because Katsuki wouldn't let him hang it around his neck. When I got home that day, my mother gave me an earful. She was upset that I had ignored her after the USJ incident and that I hadn't told her about my new fire trick. After half an hour of scolding, she hugged me and admitted she had passed out several times while watching the sports festival out of worry. I joked that it sounded like I had done more work than she had, and she told me not to mock her. I said I was just glad it was over. My mother observed that it might not be over for Katsuki. From the way he acted during the awards, she would be surprised if he forgave me. I pointed out that he had acted like he wanted to lose to me, and she reminded me that I was not only his friend but also the vigilante rumored never to have lost a fight until now, apparently. I protested that I didn't want to fight Katsuki like I fought villains. Those were different situations. She sighed and said we both knew I had never intended to win the festival and that Katsuki probably understood that too, even if he had given it his all while I pushed myself out of bounds with that move. Apologizing to Katsuki felt like it would do more harm than good. If anything, it might only make him angrier. I had two options: find a way to get Katsuki to talk to me, or find better friends. For now, I decided to stick with the first option. Making new friends was annoying. Back at school, I walked into class and took my seat. Katsuki ignored me while a few classmates greeted me. We waited for Aizawa. He congratulated the class on their performance at the sports festival and noted areas to improve. Most students clapped briefly before Aizawa moved on to the harder part: recommendations. Momo asked if everyone would get a recommendation, and Aizawa confirmed that no matter the performance at the sports festival, everyone would receive at least one recommendation. He then turned on the projector. Names with numbers popped up on the screen. Todoroki Shoto, 1569. Bakugo Katsuki, 1499. Tokoyami Fumikaji, 986. Ida Tenya, 875. Kirishima Ejiro, 874. Kaminari Denki, 765. Ashido Mina, 590. Shiro Hinata, 489. Midoriya Izuku. The class erupted, unable to believe that Midoriya had only one request. Midoriya shrugged and said he thought they were scared of him. Kaminari asked if they were really scared of him, and Midoriya explained that, as the savior of Japan, a low-ranking hero would be crazy to try to teach him. Shiro wondered who had requested Midoriya, and Midoriya admitted he had no idea. Aizawa shook his head, pulled out a stack of papers, and told the students that the papers were the names of the heroes who had requested them. He instructed everyone to look through the lists carefully and then write down the top 3 they would accept. Midoriya took his single sheet and read the lone name on it. Hero, Gran Torino. Rank, unavailable. Agency, unavailable. Description, unavailable. Reason for requesting you: reckless brat needs a lesson. Midoriya studied the paper a moment longer and noticed writing in the bottom corner indicating that All Might wanted him to meet in the teacher's lounge after class. Since learning that All Might worked at UA, Midoriya had never actually met him outside of the awards ceremony, though Katsuki had mentioned a hero lesson with All Might a few days before Midoriya was accepted. Midoriya wondered why All Might wanted to talk to him and why he had never heard of Gran Torino, which bothered him because he knew almost every hero across all 7 continents from years of being alone. He decided to accept Gran Torino's request and hoped the man was not a villain in disguise. Midoriya glanced at the top of Katsuki's paper and saw that the hero who had requested him was Best Jeanist, ranked 3rd. He did not read further but expressed curiosity about who had requested the great Bakugo Katsuki. Bakugo glared and demanded to know who requested Midoriya, but Midoriya said the information was confidential and reminded him it was none of his business. Bakugo tried to argue, then Midoriya announced he had places to be and ran out the door. Midoriya realized he did not know where the teacher's lounge was, sighed, and returned to class. Aizawa asked if Midoriya had just run out the door. Midoriya replied that he had important business and asked Aizawa for the location of the teacher's lounge. Aizawa refused, and when Midoriya insisted that the business involved him, both of them turned toward the door and saw All Might. All Might admitted he had forgotten Midoriya might not know where the teacher's lounge was and invited Midoriya to follow him. They walked for a short time, and All Might opened the teacher's lounge door for Midoriya. Inside, a man stood in the middle of the room with his back turned. All Might announced that he had brought Midoriya. The man turned and introduced himself as Mirio Togata. Midoriya felt a flicker of unease and suspected this meeting might not go as smoothly as hoped. All Might and Mirio then explained some background. One for All was the true name of All Might's quirk. It had been passed down from All Might's teacher, and All Might had passed aspects of it to Mirio. Midoriya thought Mirio was a fitting candidate to be a symbol of peace. Mirio's original quirk was permeation, but with One for All he had gained strength and speed similar to All Might's. When Midoriya asked why they were telling him this, All Might explained that Gran Torino had once been Mirio's mentor and had requested Mirio in his first year. Mirio confirmed that Gran Torino had requested him and had taught him to control his power. All Might added that they did not know why Gran Torino had requested Midoriya, but he warned that Gran Torino was intimidating. Mirio interrupted with a challenge, saying he liked Midoriya and wanted to spar to see who would win. Midoriya accepted the offer. All Might cautioned Midoriya that it was not too late to change his mind about going to Gran Torino, but Midoriya insisted that the request itself was reason enough to meet him, especially since All Might and Mirio had reassured him that Gran Torino was not a villain. All Might gave a hesitant smile and accepted Midoriya's decision. Mirio offered a parting handshake, which Midoriya returned, and they agreed to meet again. Midoriya left the teacher's lounge and headed toward the student cafeteria, where he found Katsuki sitting alone at a table and picking at his food. I headed over to the table and sat across from him. Deku opened his mouth to speak, but Katsuki cut him off and refused to hear an apology. Katsuki told him he did not want to hear a lame apology. Deku lied that he had not intended to give one. Katsuki shook his head and told him whatever he wanted to say. Deku tried again and said he was sorry. Katsuki slammed his hands on the table and cursed Deku. Deku smiled faintly and asked what was wrong. Katsuki accused him of offering excuses and reminded him that he had told Deku to give it his all, then accused him of pushing himself out of bounds. Deku insisted it had been an accident. Katsuki told him to be quiet and argued that it did not matter whether it was an accident, that Deku had planned something like that from the start. When Deku did not answer, Katsuki asked if he had lost his voice and demanded to know what had happened to the boy who always had something to say. Deku glared at him and called him an idiot. Katsuki retaliated by calling Deku a coward. Deku laughed and said Katsuki did not scare him. Katsuki demanded to know why Deku had lost on purpose if he was not afraid. Deku repeated that he had not wanted to win. Katsuki dismissed that as nonsense and accused Deku of acting like he wanted to lose. Deku said he did not want to win. Katsuki insisted he had wanted to beat Deku fairly with his own power and accused Deku of being a coward. Deku stood up and declared the whole situation ridiculous before walking away. Katsuki yelled coward after him. Deku went to the bathroom and locked himself in a stall, thinking that Katsuki was an idiot. Deku had expected Katsuki to understand why he had avoided winning, but instead Katsuki threw a tantrum over victory. Deku resolved to go out that night. Bakugo's perspective painted the same scene differently. He watched Deku stand and called him a coward as he left. Bakugo swore under his breath that he had told Deku to give it his all. Instead, Bakugo thought Deku had gone all out with his moves and then lost on purpose. At the table, someone pointed out that Deku and the others were not a threat and that things were different when Deku fought villains, since villains could and had hurt people. The person added that Deku was likely subconsciously holding back because he did not want to hurt his friends. Bakugo frowned at the memory and convinced himself that Deku was looking down on him, that Deku probably did not see him as an equal and only pitied him. Shitty Hair approached Bakugo and asked if he and Midoriya were okay. Bakugo rolled his eyes and said they were fine. Shitty Hair mentioned that their earlier conversation had seemed bad and reminded Bakugo that they had not seen each other for years. Bakugo snapped that it was none of his concern. Shitty Hair pointed out that Deku had tried to apologize, which showed he felt bad, and urged Bakugo to care because Deku was his best friend. Bakugo dismissed Deku as nothing and Shitty Hair sighed sadly, calling the fight unmanly and reminding Bakugo that Midoriya often fought villains and must get injured sometimes. Shitty Hair suggested that Deku subconsciously held back against people he cared about. Bakugo muttered that he was surrounded by idiots. School finally let out for Deku. He left the classroom as quickly as he could and ran home, calling out that he was back. His mother answered from the living room, and he found her on the couch mending a hole in his vigilante suit. Deku told her she did not have to bother, but she smiled and insisted it was the least she could do. Deku said he was planning to go out, and his mother asked him to tell her about his day first. Deku told her he had received a request. His mother asked who it was from and reacted with interest when Deku named Gran Torino, mentioning that Gran Torino had trained All Might when he was younger. Deku explained that he had not known Gran Torino well but had confirmation from All Might that he was not a villain. His mother urged him to go and take care of business, and Deku ran to his room to suit up. On the news, an announcer praised the vigilante Deku for returning after 3 weeks and bringing many villains into custody in one night. Shigaraki watched the report and grumbled at the name. He called for Kurogyri and asked if the other man had heard of the vigilante. Kurogyri said he had heard things and that the vigilante ruthlessly took out villains, earning the gratitude of the public. Shigaraki concluded that they should bring this vigilante in. Deku woke feeling sore. He muttered a curse as he got out of bed and felt the lingering pain in his left shoulder and right leg from the previous night's encounters. His leg hurt when he put pressure on it. The villain who had managed to land a hit on him had a quirk that let him turn parts of his body into spikes. During their fight, the villain's hand had formed a spike and struck Deku's leg. In return, Deku had singed the other man's eyebrows. The pain in Deku's arm was his own fault. Earlier, while saving a child from stepping into traffic, he had pulled a muscle. It had not troubled him until later when a miscalculated backflip during a fight aggravated it. Despite those setbacks, Deku felt that last night had gone well overall. I turned a few villains over to the police and rescued a child. It felt like a pretty successful night. What SCKS is that today is a school day? No, today is the start of the internships. That's still SCKS. I change into my school uniform and head downstairs. My mother notices the limp and asks what happened. I think about how she's fine with me doing vigilante work, but as soon as she can see a scratch she rushes me to the hospital and tries to ground me. I tell her I just pulled something and that it's fine, grabbing my bag. She asks about my shoulder, and I lie that I must have slept on it wrong. She tells me to make sure I have everything I need for the internship, and I show her my duffel bag. She walks over, kisses me on the cheek, and says she'll see me when I get back. I hug her quickly and head for the door. It's raining. I don't go back inside to fetch an umbrella. I use my telekinesis to keep the raindrops from hitting me and run to UA instead of taking the train. Ever since the sports festival, strangers have been talking to me more and more. At first the congratulations were nice, but now it's starting to get on my nerves. When I get to UA, I see Ida hanging up his jacket. It's been a while since the sports festival, and I already know why he had to leave early. His older brother, Ingenium, was attacked by the hero killer Stain and ended up in the hospital with severe injuries. I walk over and greet him using his nickname, Prez. Ida turns around and asks if I'm all right. I tell him I heard about his brother and that I'm sorry. He insists there's no need to apologize and says I had nothing to do with it. I ask how his brother is, and he replies that he's being cared for and that there's nothing to worry about, but when I grab his shoulder and warn him that revenge is never the answer, he stops looking at me. I tell him I saw who he picked to intern with and that I'm not stupid. I tell him not to be an idiot, that I understand wanting to avenge his brother but that he's not the one to take justice into his own hands. He finally admits, in a whisper, that his brother suffered an injury that left him unable to continue as a hero. I don't know how to respond. He continues that it's all the fault of the attacker, and I tell him again that it's not his job to teach anyone a lesson, and that justice will come but not at the hands of a 16-year-old. He laughs softly, tells himself that as class president he shouldn't be behaving this way, thanks me for the advice, and walks away. Great, now I've got to worry about Prez. In the classroom I look for Todoroki. I know he's interning at his father's agency to learn to use his fire, which makes sense. Endeavor tends to patrol areas around Mizushima's agency, where there's more crime, and I want to talk to Todoroki about Ida and see if he can help watch over him. I sit in the seat in front of Todoroki and say hello. He responds in his usual measured tone. I put a news article about Tensei and Stain on his desk. Todoroki reads it, recognizes that it's about Ida's older brother, and asks why I'm showing it to him. I explain that Ida wants to avenge his brother and that he deliberately chose to intern with Mizushima because the agency is in the area where the attack happened. Todoroki asks who Mizushima is, and I tell him it's the Pro-Hero Manual Agency. I tell Todoroki that his father likes to patrol the same areas as Mizushima because there's more crime there, and ask him to keep an eye on Ida if he ever sees him. I add that if he texts his location and I find Prez first, I'll do the same. Todoroki agrees and asks one more question: why I'm telling him instead of Bakugo, since Best Jeanist also patrols in that area. I explain that I've met Hakamata before and that taking Katsuki on patrol would be the last thing on his mind. Todoroki asks who Hakamata is, and I tell him he's Best Jeanist. When Todoroki presses whether I trust him more than Bakugo for this, I admit that for this particular situation I do. I explain that Bakugo's quirk and temper aren't right for the kind of subtle tracking this requires and that his personality could get him into trouble. I finish by reminding Todoroki that I've faced Stain before. I tell him that Stain believes the only true hero in the world is All Might and considers the rest to be fake, doing it for fame and money. Todoroki listens, and we agree to stay aware of Ida's movements while keeping one another informed. Midoriya whispered that he did not think Katsuki would take that lightly and kept the part about staying quiet so others would not hear. Kirishima stared at Midoriya, nodded, and offered to help. Midoriya said he was glad, took out a piece of paper, wrote his phone number, and handed it to Kirishima. Kirishima thanked him and agreed to text later so Midoriya would have his number too. Midoriya nodded in return and went back to his seat. As Midoriya sat down, Katsuki asked since when he had become best buds with Icy Hot. Midoriya replied that Katsuki should ask Kirishima the same question. Katsuki grunted and looked away. Midoriya observed that it was obvious Kirishima wanted to be friends with Katsuki. He thought that Kirishima would be a good influence. Kirishima was kind and open, while Katsuki always assumed people looked down on him and felt he had to prove himself. Their friendship would not change much for Midoriya. After 5 or 6 years apart, Katsuki was still his best friend. The classroom quieted when Aizawa walked in. Aizawa announced that they would be doing something that would help determine their futures as heroes before internships. Midoriya thought another pop quiz was coming. Aizawa said they would pick code names. A few moments later, Midnight entered in her hero outfit. Aizawa explained that code names were not his expertise and Midnight would help the class choose them, then retreated into his sleeping bag. Midnight encouraged the students. Aoyama Yuga proudly presented a name that Midoriya considered a sentence, and Midnight suggested tightening it up. Midoriya shook his head in disbelief and pulled out a notebook to jot things down, privately rating Aoyama's choice low. Ashido Mina stepped forward with the suggestion Alien Queen, and Midnight asked her to consider something else. Midoriya thought Alien Queen suited Mina better than the alternative she offered. Azuitsu presented her name, Froppy, which the class cheered and Midoriya thought fit her perfectly. One by one the class presented their picks. Kirishima Ijiro chose Red Riot, which Midoriya found solid but not original. Jiro Kyoka picked Earphone Jack, which Midoriya admired. Kaminari Denki selected Charge Bolt, and Midoriya thought it fit. Shoji Mizo chose Tentacle, Siro Hanta called himself Cellophane, Ojiro Mashireo went with Tailman, and Sato Rikido chose Sugarman. Midoriya found these reasonable if not remarkable. Hagakure Toru's choice of Invisible Girl seemed obvious to Midoriya, and he thought she might prefer something less literal. Yaoyorozu Momo chose Creati, which Midoriya believed suited her. Todoroki Shoto offered simply Shoto, which Midoriya thought unimaginative. Tokoyami Fumikage chose Tsukuyami, a name Midoriya respected. Mineta Minoru picked Grape Juice, and Midoriya rated it better than some. Kota Koji selected Anima, which Midoriya approved of. When Bakugo Katsuki presented a name that was not approved, Midoriya mentally rated it very poorly, noting that some things about Katsuki had not changed. Uraraka Achiko chose Uravity, which Midoriya thought brilliant. Ida Tenya insisted on using his own name, and Midoriya wished he would have taken Ingenium instead. After Midnight praised everyone's efforts and returned control to Aizawa, Kaminari raised a question about Midoriya's hero name. Midoriya explained that he already had a name and shrugged at the disappointed faces around him. Kirishima commented that they had expected Midoriya might change his name from Deku to something else. Uraraka asked where Deku had come from, and Midoriya explained that when he was younger the kids at his previous school had called him that because it was an alternate reading of his name, and when he later thought up a hero named Deku was the only thing he could come up with. Siro asked who had realized Deku was another reading of his name, and Midoriya indicated that everyone's eyes turned to Katsuki. Midoriya muttered that no one had ever corrected Katsuki because they had been too scared, and Katsuki glared in response. Kirishima asked about the origin of the nickname Kaken. Midoriya explained that when he first met Katsuki he had mispronounced his name and combined the first two letters with a friendly suffix, which had stuck. Katsuki rolled his eyes when Midoriya suggested that Kaken should be his hero name. Katsuki laughed and dismissed the idea. Later, the class waited at the train station while Aizawa laid out the rules and expectations for their internships. Aizawa asked if they understood, and Mina enthusiastically responded yes while holding her hero costume case in the air. Aizawa told her to tone it down and sent the students toward their trains. Midoriya checked in with Todoroki to confirm the plan for their internship work. Todoroki affirmed that he remembered, and Midoriya asked him to text later before heading off to find Ida. A classmate called to Midoriya, asking if he should head toward his train. Midoriya said he planned to walk there and then reminded the student not to do anything reckless. The student expressed thanks, and Midoriya thought of Ida as his friend, expecting they would look out for one another. A classmate told Midoriya that he could talk to him. Midoriya stammered that they were friends and that he would keep that in mind. The classmate smiled softly, waved, and walked toward his train. Aizawa stopped Midoriya and asked what that was about walking. Aizawa stared him down and Midoriya admitted he did not like trains because there were too many people. Aizawa then told Midoriya that he had heard about what he did the night before saving a child from traffic and turning in 20 villains and teased that Midoriya was getting a bit rusty. Midoriya blamed the overwhelming amount of homework. Aizawa warned him to watch his language. Midoriya dismissed him and said he would see Aizawa in a week as he headed off. Aizawa called after him that he had noticed the limp, and Midoriya picked up his pace. Midoriya found the rundown building he had been looking for, a shabby structure with graffiti and a slightly ajar door. He pushed it open, stepped inside, and called out to see if anyone was there. His eyes landed on a motionless figure in the middle of the room, and a surge of apprehension made him turn to leave. He decided to walk away, telling himself he was leaving. Someone suddenly shouted that they were alive. Midoriya spun around, startled. Standing in front of him was a short older man in a bright yellow costume, the kind that seemed at odds with his slight, harmless smile. The man explained that he had dropped some hot dogs. Midoriya was confused and wondered if this was the Tashinori he knew. The old man answered that he was not who Midoriya thought, and the brief exchange left Midoriya unsettled. He excused himself for a moment and stepped outside to use his phone. He searched his contacts for All Might's number, which All Might had given him after their encounter with Mirio, just in case of an emergency. Midoriya could not imagine that this old man could teach him anything. When Midoriya turned back into the room, the older man was rummaging through the hero costume case that Yue had given him. He commented that he had expected the costume Midoriya used for Vigilante work. The old man pulled a new hero costume from the case and tossed it at Midoriya, instructing him to put it on. Midoriya hesitated and protested, but the old man insisted that Midoriya show he was not as clueless as he had looked at the sports festival. Midoriya muttered that he needed a minute and went to find a private room. In the privacy of the small room he examined the costume. It was nothing like his vigilante outfit, teal green with a metal mask, a red belt, white gloves, and odd black knee pieces. The hood had two rounded protrusions that looked like bunny ears, which made him roll his eyes. In a pocket of the belt he found a note from Yue explaining that they had redesigned his costume and encouraged him to try the new look. He sighed, set the note aside, and put the costume on except for the gloves and mask, which he left off because they would only get in the way. He left the room and announced that he was ready. The old man told him to demonstrate the flashy move Midoriya had used at the sports festival. Midoriya laughed nervously and said that if he used that move indoors he might cause a lot of damage. The old man shrugged at the younger generation's overconfidence, then suddenly moved with surprising speed, launching from wall to wall around the room. The old man shouted that he was losing patience and kicked out toward Midoriya, aiming to unsettle him. Midoriya steadied himself and called out that he was ready. The old man continued to move in a blur, leaping and striking objects around the room to show force without doing anything gruesome. Appliances and fixtures were sent flying in theatrical, anime-style explosions of motion microwaves, and shelves toppled and cracked under the impact while smoke and dust filled the air for a moment. The old man paused on top of a microwave and asked incredulously whether Midoriya still could not see his true strength. Midoriya concentrated on the old man's movement patterns, trying to find a rhythm. He realized there had to be a pattern or hint about where the old man would move next. When the old man launched again, Midoriya grabbed at his leg before he could strike. Using focused telekinesis, Midoriya propelled the older man theatrically into a wall. The older man tumbled and then sprang back to his feet, smiling as if nothing serious had happened. The old man admitted Midoriya's skill at analysis and prediction, and Midoriya shrugged and said his moves were easy to read. The older man laughed and said that he had underestimated Midoriya, but that there was still room to improve. He praised Midoriya's control of his quirks while warning that enemies would not wait for him to get stronger over time. Midoriya had to grow now. The old man announced he was going to get some food and left Midoriya with the mess, saying he would handle the cleaning when he returned. Midoriya rolled his eyes and looked over the wreckage. He could not do much about the broken microwave, but with his telekinesis he smoothed the walls and tidied what he could. He took off the new costume and changed into a sweatshirt and pants, thinking about the old man's words. There was more he could do if he tried. Shigaraki wondered what that was supposed to mean. He thought he had beaten the other and, if anything, he should be the one telling him what to do better. Shigaraki remembered the conversation that followed. A man asked whether they were the ones who had gotten into UA and whether Shigaraki wanted to join them. Shigaraki shrugged and said they wanted him because he had experience. The man then asked what Shigaraki was after. Shigaraki replied that, at the moment, he wanted to kill All Might and then deal with anything else he did not like, and he pulled a photograph from his pocket. He showed the picture of Midoriya Izuku and told the man that he wanted the boy to join as well and that he had heard the man had run into him before. The man stared at the picture, then looked back at Shigaraki and told him he had been foolish to be interested. He called Shigaraki the type of person he hated most, someone with childish motives. Shigaraki was taken aback as the man began to draw his swords. Izuku was left in the rundown house when the old man fell asleep, and boredom settled in. With little else to do, he had written in his journal about what he had learned earlier. He recorded that Gran Torino was a pro-hero, a retired hero who had once taught All Might and had worked at UA for a year. Izuku noted not knowing the quirk's official name, but that it allowed the user to shoot air from their feet, granting incredible speed and jumping power. Gran Torino used it to move quickly and strike before enemies could react. Izuku added that Gran Torino was strange, one moment confused and feeble-looking, the next precise and intimidating. He admitted that Gran Torino had landed a hit on him, but Izuku had fought back and won. He rated Gran Torino a solid hero but docked points because Gran Torino's comments got on his nerves. Izuku sighed and stood up. He refused to sit idly while he was in Yamanashi. He went to his room, pulled his vigilante costume from his bag, dressed, and headed out. As he walked, he thought about the old man's remark that he could do more if he tried. What more could there be? He already had good control of his quirk and could use it well. He replayed the sports festival and the USJ incident in his mind. He was better at close combat but not bad at fighting from a distance. He turned into an alley and experimented. He knew he could use telekinesis to propel himself somewhat, but what if he could do what the old man did? He stared at a building wall and used his telekinesis to push himself onto it, forcing himself to stick. Then he launched himself toward the opposite wall. He repeated the motion up the buildings until he reached the rooftops. He muttered that he had to do it 10 times faster, then jumped off and landed in the alley, using his telekinesis to soften the fall. He tried again, faster and more focused, so absorbed in his movements that he did not notice faint green sparks forming around his body until he took a break. Izuku wondered what the sparks meant. He remembered his mother using telekinesis to move toys and the little green sparks she produced when concentrating on multiple objects, but these were larger and brighter. He found it interesting, then called it a night and returned to the rundown building. He took off his vigilante suit and went to sleep. The next morning the old man asked where Izuku had gone. The previous night. Izuku replied that he thought the old man had been asleep. The old man warned him not to overwork himself on the first day. Izuku said he had just gone out to try something and took a seat at the table. The old man told him they would talk more later, but for now they should eat, producing a box of frozen pastries. Izuku questioned how the old man would warm them with a broken microwave. The old man nodded toward another box behind Izuku and asked him to open it. Izuku opened it to find a brand new microwave and swore in surprise when a pastry playfully hit the back of his head. The old man scolded him to watch his language. Izuku shook his head, unpacked the microwave, plugged it in, and placed the pastries on a plate. He set the plate in the microwave and took it out after the beep. The old man said he had been waiting all morning for the pastries, then complained that they were still cold. Deku POV. Gran Torino stared at the green sparks Deku produced and asked if that was what he had been working on last night. Deku explained that his mother could make sparks too when concentrating, but hers were nothing like these. Gran Torino suggested the difference was that Deku's quirk was stronger and asked if the sparks could do anything. Deku shrugged and said the sparks only showed he was very focused on his telekinesis. Gran Torino, thinking for a moment, then challenged Deku to fight him again using that ability, gesturing toward the sparks. Deku answered that the old man should be prepared to be beaten, and the training began much like before, except this time Deku was ready for the attacks and managed to dodge them. Deku attempted to use telekinesis to stop Gran Torino, but the older man was too quick to get a solid hold. The exchange continued with Gran Torino leaping about and striking while Deku stayed in place, sidestepping. Feeling that the drill was taking too long, Deku searched for an opening. He noticed the couch out of the corner of his eye, sprinted toward it, and dove beneath it. Gran Torino lunged for the couch, and Deku used telekinesis to push it upward, sending the older man tumbling up and lightly bumping the ceiling in a burst of rapid, stylized motion that looked more like an exaggerated anime beat than anything dangerous. Gran Torino called out that Deku had won and told him to set him down. Deku lowered the couch and the old man gently and rose from the floor. Gran Torino shook his head and remarked on the rough treatment of an elderly person. Deku smiled inwardly, pleased to recognize his own improvement from staying with Torino. Torino decided that they would go out that night. Deku asked where, and Torino clarified that they were going out and instructed him to wear the new costume rather than his vigilante outfit. Torino explained that no one had seen Deku in this official costume, so it would attract less dangerous attention. Deku agreed and went to his room. Deku collected the costume made by the support course and a pair of scissors. Having built his own costume before, he had a basic sense of what to do. He cut off the sleeves and modified the white gloves so they covered only his hands rather than his entire forearms. He inspected the mask, a metal piece that was not like the gas-style Vigilante mask he had used previously, and noticed it had holes. On a whim, he brought the mask to his face and expelled a small stream of fire. The flame and air flowed through the mask and out a hole, and Deku grinned, pleased that the support course had made something useful. After a few more small adjustments, Deku finalized the costume, a teal-green tank top with black stripes and a hood that had odd bunny-like protrusions, matching pants with a red belt, white gloves, a metal mask, red shoes, and black knee pads. He felt proud of how it looked and resolved to do something about the ears after his internship. A few hours later, Torino announced that it was time to go out and take on some villains. Deku followed and asked why they were doing this. Torino explained that if Deku only sparred with him while at the internship, he might develop bad habits, and that it would be useful for Deku to face real situations. Deku said he had planned to go out anyway, since villains would not wait for his internship to be over. Torino chuckled at Deku leaving without permission but warned him not to get too excited, noting they were unlikely to run into anything major. They paused at the street and Torino hailed a car. On the ride, Deku asked about their destination and learned they were heading to an area with a decreasing population and low crime. Torino explained that most agencies were located in high-population areas because crime concentrated there. When Deku realized they would be stopping in Shibuya and that they would take the bullet train from Kofu to Shinjuku, his thoughts went to Hosu City and the fact that Todoroki had not yet sent any message about Ida. Todoroki had only sent random messages asking how Deku's internship was going. Deku reflected that Todoroki seemed to have father-related issues but that his internship with his father was going all right according to what Todoroki had said. Still, Deku remained worried about Ida. Ida POV. Manuel, the agency supervisor, hesitated and then brought up a difficult question. He asked if Ida was pursuing the hero killer. Ida froze at the question. He asked which friend had passed that information along, unable to think of anyone Manuel might be friends with who would know about his motivations. And the only person who caught on to my plans was Midoriya. Midoriya used Deku's name, and Manuel asked if I was friends with Deku. I explained that we were not really friends but had met a few times. Back when Deku was wanted by the police, I would sometimes chase him and try to catch him, though I never did. Manuel laughed, and I thought, of course Midoriya would happen to know Manuel. Manuel reminded me that as a hero I should not act on a personal grudge and that heroes do not have the authority to make arrests. He hurried to clarify that he was not saying the hero killer should not be arrested, he just did not want me to get hurt and he thought I was a good kid who should not get caught up in that. I agreed that he and Midoriya were right, seeking revenge was not something a hero would do. Manuel sighed with relief and nodded. He added that Deku was a good person and clearly cared about me. Deku texted him almost every 2 hours asking how I was because I would not answer him. A wave of guilt hit me as I processed Manuel's words. Midoriya teased that he did not bite. I walked over hesitantly, reminding myself that a hero should be able to meet new people. I introduced myself as Ida Tenya and offered my hand. Midoriya smiled and shook it. Later, I scolded the class about swearing, telling them it was not something a hero in training should take pride in and that both Midoriya and Bakugo needed to break the habit. Bakugo, irritated, put his fingers to his temples and said he was trying to see things from my point of view but could not go that far. Some classmates laughed and my face grew hot. Midoriya stood up and put a hand on my shoulder, telling me not to take it personally and expressing hope that we could become good friends. I nodded. Bakugo then admitted, bluntly, that my refusal to swear made him uncomfortable. I thought to myself that Midoriya was not a bad person, though laughing would not be the best example. When Midoriya greeted me, I was relieved it was him and not a teacher. He looked me over and reminded me that the sports festival was not the only one I would be able to participate in. There would always be next year and the year after. He urged me to go see my brother and promised to tell Aizawa that something had come up. I thanked him. Later he asked if I was all right, explaining that he had heard about my brother and was sorry. I told him there was no need to apologize because he had nothing to do with it. When he asked how my brother was, I said he was fine and there was nothing to worry about, stopping myself from revealing the whole truth. As I turned to walk away, Midoriya caught my shoulder and warned me that revenge was never the answer. Deku POV. Deku asked Torino if he was going to stay awake. It was pretty late and Deku did not want him to fall asleep. Torino grumbled that night was when things got interesting and that there was more crime activity then. Deku shook his head and pulled out his phone to check on Manuel, a hero his friend was interning under. Torino teased about using a smartphone while sitting next to someone, and Deku explained that he was checking in on Manuel because the friend wanted revenge for his brother, and Deku wanted to keep an eye on him. When Torino asked if he meant the explosive one, Deku laughed and clarified that he meant Ida Tenya. A passenger suddenly shouted that a building had exploded. Smoke was visible in the distance. The intercom instructed passengers to hold onto their seats. The train stopped abruptly and Deku was thrown against the seat in front of him. He heard a crash and turned to see a hero struggling. A monstrous body, one of the Nomu, seized the hero and slammed him to the floor with brutal force. Fear rippled through the car as people scrambled. Deku identified it as a Nomu and began to stand, but Torino ordered him to sit back down and watch over the passengers. Deku insisted he had fought similar opponents before, but Torino insisted more strongly that he stay with the passengers. Before Deku could argue further, Torino leapt through the train, kicked the Nomu out of the carriage, and used his quirk to blast it into a building. Deku moved to the gap in the train, ready to jump after it, then looked to the right and froze at what he saw. Ida POV. Manuel had run toward the chaos and called out that villains were involved. Ida followed Manuel, thinking that this did not fit the pattern of the hero killer, who preferred to work in the shadows. He took an alley and then saw the figure he had been concerned about. Ida charged forward and attempted to strike, but the man used his sword to knock off Ida's helmet and send him crashing to the ground. The man told him this place was not for children. Ida recognized the hero killer Stain and confronted him, demanding to know if it was him. Stain studied Ida, then pointed his sword and warned him to be careful with his words, threatening violence if necessary. Ida rose and declared that he was the younger brother of a hero Stain had attacked, that he had an older brother he admired, and that he had come to do what his brother could no longer do. He demanded that Stain take a name and vowed that the name Ingenium would live on as the hero who would defeat him. Stain responded by ordering Ida to die. Todoroki intervened in an instant. He sent a blast of fire that forced Stain to disengage from Ida and created an opening. Todoroki jumped to stand between Ida and Stain. Ida, stunned at first, realized Midoriya had been right about his determination. Ida reported that he could not move properly ever since Stain had struck him. Deku POV. The attendant called for everyone to calm down and return to their seats, assuring them heroes would arrive shortly. Deku decided he was going out and ignored the attendant's alarm. He pulled his mask over his face and hopped out of the train, running toward the chaos. The Nomu that had attacked the train looked different from the one at USJ, more grotesque in silhouette and far more numerous than Deku had hoped. The sight suggested that Handyman had created more. Deku activated his telekinesis and lifted himself into the air, green sparks appearing at small intervals. He had two options: find Torino or head toward the most immediate danger. Confident Torino would be all right, Deku used his quirk to fly toward the fire. On the street he saw a truck hurled into the air. He used telekinesis to set it aside and heard a call for Tenya. Manuel and several other heroes were fighting a group of Nomu, while Manuel called out for Ida. Other heroes urged Manuel to use his quirk to put out the flames. One hero told Deku he was in the way, and Deku replied in thought that the hero should step aside. Deku ran past the hero and drew a Nomu's attention by taunting it. He pulled his mask down and released a burst of fire at it. The Nomu collapsed, incapacitated. Deku replaced his mask as smoke curled from his mouth and offered a quiet apology over the fallen opponent before sprinting toward Manuel. Manuel told Deku that he did not know where Ida was. One moment he had been running behind Manuel and the next he was gone. Deku scolded himself for thinking Ida had been careless. He heard a crash behind him and saw another hero engaged with a Nomu. Deku pushed forward, knowing he could not leave while people were still in danger. Todoroki POV. Todoroki had confronted the hero killer after Ida accused him of being a criminal who had hurt his brother. As Stain turned to react, Todoroki blasted him with fire to create space. He moved to protect Ida, who asked in disbelief if Todoroki was there. Todoroki thought that Midoriya had been right about Ida's resolve to face Stain. Ida did not meet his eyes and explained that he had been unable to move ever since Stain had struck him, likely a result of Stain's quirk. Todoroki scanned the area and noticed another figure who appeared to be a hero joining the fight. Todoroki told himself that if it had been only Ida, he would have carried him away, but there was someone else now. Ida warned Todoroki not to get involved and insisted this was his fight. Todoroki asked what he meant. Stain told Todoroki that, since his friend had come to save him, the friend would have to die as well, and he produced a knife. Todoroki knew he could not handle this alone. He thought of Midoriya and his father, and while keeping his hand behind his back he retrieved his phone and quietly sent his location to both of them. Before he had left, he had told his father to deal with the Nomu and, when finished, to send people toward the alleys. Todoroki had told his father to press on without him when a shout had interrupted their pursuit. Now he had to buy time while protecting both Ida and the wounded hero on the ground. Ida shouted at Todoroki again to run, insisting Todoroki had nothing to do with this. Todoroki refused, thinking that if he ran he could not call himself a hero, and that leaving now would put Ida and the other hero in danger. Stain laughed with contempt. Todoroki admitted to himself that he was not strong in close combat, so he had to make do from a distance. He sent a spray of ice at Stain's feet in an attempt to freeze him and create an opening to get Ida and the fallen hero to safety. A knife whooshed past and grazed his cheek, stinging but not deep. He retaliated with a blast of fire, but Stain moved in a heartbeat. Stain touched the blade in a way that activated his quirk and Todoroki went still for a moment. Ida called out Todoroki's name in alarm. Stain conceded that Todoroki had made a smart choice by avoiding close combat, but he dismissed him as still being a kid. Stain walked past Todoroki toward Ida. Todoroki shouted for him to stop as Stain closed in. A sudden blast of fire struck Stain just as he was about to harm Ida. Stain shouted in frustration at so many people getting in his way that day. He then stilled, surprised, and demanded to know who else had arrived. Midoriya stepped forward and said he had answered his friend's text message. Stain questioned what Midoriya was doing there. Midoriya approached Todoroki and declared he was not leaving. Stain demanded both Midoriya and Todoroki stay out of it and insisted that Ingenium had the right to this fight. Midoriya called Ida by his given name and told him to shut up, which startled Todoroki because Midoriya usually used Ida's nickname, Prez. Todoroki accused Ida, thinking about the change in his friend's expression since he had last known him as Ingenium. Midoriya quietly asked Ida his blood type. Ida answered type O, and Midoriya smiled, saying that meant Ida would be able to help soon. Midoriya moved into position, and he and Stain faced each other like rivals. Stain lamented the fate of true heroes, and Midoriya responded with a mixture of pride and sarcasm at being seen as a true hero. Stain reached for his knives. Midoriya used his telekinetic ability to snatch Stain's weapons into the air. The knives circled Midoriya in a bright, crackling glow. Midoriya launched the knives back at Stain. Several struck home, but Stain dodged many and seemed impervious to their effects. He used one blade against Midoriya in an attempt to immobilize him. Midoriya dodged one attack, but another struck his leg. Midoriya swore at the pain, and before he could react Stain applied his technique and Midoriya froze in place. Stain mocked Midoriya for being weaker than before and, turning away, advanced on Ida. He taunted Ida for having friends who risked themselves for nothing and forced Ida under his foot to pin him down. Todoroki glanced at Midoriya and saw him pale and breathing quickly, but the sparks around Midoriya's body actually flared brighter. Todoroki remembered the sports festival, when Midoriya had broken a mind control quirk, and realized Midoriya might be trying to fight Stain's influence. Todoroki understood that Stain's ability required close contact in a particular way to work. While Stain's back was turned, Todoroki shifted his arm enough to form an icicle and tried to strike from behind, but Stain moved away before the blow landed. Stain guessed the blood type and mocked Todoroki silently. Midoriya suddenly freed himself and shouted that it was unfair to be outnumbered. He taunted Stain, then launched into a blur of motion, bouncing off walls at incredible speed with green sparks trailing him. Todoroki used the distraction to send more ice at Stain. Midoriya charged with a fiery fist and attempted to land a punch. Stain dodged and tried to counter with a blade, but Todoroki blocked that attempt with a wall of ice. Midoriya used his telekinesis to lift Stain into the air and warned that it would be a shame to let go. Stain threw a knife that hit Midoriya in the leg again, and Midoriya cursed as the effects took hold and he became immobilized once more. Midoriya demanded that Stain stop. It was strange that Stain kept aiming for the same spot. Stain sneered that Midoriya had chosen to fight with an injury. Midoriya stared at Stain with anger and then dropped his hand. Stain fell but managed to land. Midoriya cursed as he removed the knife from his leg and threw it aside. Stain grabbed the knife and discarded it without further action. Midoriya felt sick watching the scene unfold. Deku thought he was in serious trouble. Stain kept targeting the leg he already knew was injured. Midoriya felt paralyzed by pain and the shock of what had happened. Todoroki continued fighting Stain with alternating blasts of fire and ice. Todoroki shouted for Midoriya as he sent another blast of fire at Stain. Midoriya replied that he needed just a second. There was no time to wait for Stain's quirk to wear off. Midoriya could not waste any more time. He pulsed his power like he had earlier when fighting Shinso. He stood on his good leg and tried to rejoin the fight but stumbled. Midoriya yelled at himself in frustration at his weakness. Ida began to protest, but Todoroki cut him off and demanded that he stand up if he wanted them to stop. Midoriya urged Ida to get up as well, pushing himself back to his feet. He knew he sounded harsh, but he needed everyone focused. Midoriya stood back up, black dots dancing in his vision, and he grabbed the wall for support. Todoroki called his name again. The world spun and his vision blurred. Midoriya warned that he was going to be sick and turned aside to vomit. Todoroki panicked and asked if Midoriya was okay. Midoriya snapped back that it was obvious he was not, then wiped his mouth and felt a little better as the black dots faded. Stain and Todoroki were now engaged one-on-one. Midoriya noticed Stain had recovered some of his weapons. He concentrated and used his quirk to pull them all toward him. He aimed them at Stain and sent them flying. Almost all of them struck their mark and Stain doubled over. Midoriya declared that this was the end and told Stain to give up. When Stain did not respond, Midoriya realized he had passed out. Ida finally got to his feet but avoided looking at the others. Midoriya limped over to Ida, who met him with sad eyes. Ida began to speak, but Midoriya punched him in the face and exploded in anger. Midoriya shouted that he did not care, that Ida could have died and it would have been for nothing, that he had warned him. Ida tried to explain, but Midoriya cut him off and said the matter was over and he did not want to hear anything more from him. Ida felt crushed by Midoriya's words. They tied Stain up with ropes so he could not reach his weapons if he woke. The weapons lay on the ground, out of his reach. The group moved out of the alley with Todoroki dragging Stain by the rope while Midoriya and a hero supported each other as they limped along. No one looked at Ida. He kept his head down, consumed by guilt and shame. Voices shouted nearby. A woman called that she had found them as she ran toward the scene. It turned out Todoroki's father had sent heroes to their location, including the veteran who had been with the young hero earlier. The older hero scolded them for not staying on the train. Midoriya snapped back that he had been told to watch the passengers and then had gone to where the city was on fire. The veterans argued briefly before Midoriya apologized and the older hero shook his head with a small grin. Todoroki's father teased that Midoriya had the heart of a true hero. Midoriya corrected him with a small smile, and the older hero replied with a casual nickname. After a while, an ambulance arrived and Midoriya let the veteran hero enter first. Midoriya explained that the injured hero they had found should be treated first, and a passing hero asked what had happened to the kids. Todoroki stepped aside to show Stain wrapped in rope and unconscious. The other heroes stared in horror and insisted the group could not all be so young. Midoriya introduced himself to the older hero as Deku and made a light comment about being honored to meet him. The older hero reminded them again that they were still just kids. Ida longed for Midoriya to yell at him again and call him an idiot, because hearing that would have been easier than the silence and the weight of what he had done. The title Midoriya used Prez felt like a punch to his gut and flooded him with guilt. Ida acknowledged to himself that he had been ready to kill Stain, and that was not what a hero did. He was not a hero yet, he was a student at UA without a license. If he had actually killed Stain, Ida knew he would not be praised. He would have been expelled or arrested. He watched Todoroki and Midoriya help the injured hero and felt isolated in his shame. As they walked out of the alley, they joined the heroes on the street and waited while medics and other professionals took over. The heroes were shocked at how young everyone was, and the older hero continued to chide them gently as the situation began to calm down. The hero asked if Midoriya had been arrested. Midoriya shrugged and cut him off, saying it was a long story. He began to explain what had happened when Todoroki shouted for everyone to duck. Before Midoriya could finish, a Nomu grabbed him and lifted him into the air. The creature hoisted him skyward, then suddenly began to drop. Midoriya screamed as they fell. A knife flew past and struck the Nomu, bringing it down. It crashed to the ground and Midoriya lay a few feet away, motionless. Stain stood before the fallen Nomu, movements sluggish but his presence intense. No one moved, they all stared at him. He drew a breath and thundered that hero society had fallen and that no heroes were true anymore, insisting that only All Might and Deku were real heroes. Then he stopped mid-sentence, frozen. Midoriya thought his leg was badly injured. He did not expect to be fine and return to normal. Instead, he had seen a terrifying side of the world when he encountered the Nomu and had been saved by the hero killer. He reflected on his luck with heavy sarcasm. Word later was that Stain had been seriously injured and would be out of action for a long time. After the encounter, Midoriya, Todoroki, and Ito were taken to the hospital. Todoroki was the least hurt, with only a few blows and scratches. Ida's arm had been injured and he had lost some blood, but doctors expected him to recover. Midoriya knew he had been the worst off. His leg had been wounded multiple times and several ribs had been broken. He told himself, half in jest, that he was impressive in a terrible way. A day later, the chief of police visited. He asked if they were the ones who had taken down the hero killer. Midoriya asked why the chief wanted to know. The chief reminded them that they had disobeyed orders and used their quirks without authorization. Todoroki, looking outraged, argued that they could not have stood by while their friend was attacked. The chief pointed out that their friend had sought out the hero killer himself. Todoroki started to answer but then stopped. The chief sighed and said he was not there to arrest them, though he could have, and offered a deal. They had two options. They could take credit for defeating the hero killer and face charges for unauthorized use of quirks, or they could give all the credit to Midoriya and claim they had been attacked while he had saved them. Ida muttered that the second option was essentially what had happened. Midoriya reluctantly agreed to the second option. The chief thanked them for their actions and left. Midoriya flopped back onto the bed and muttered that it was boring. He reached for his phone but found no new messages. He felt relieved that his mother and Katsuki did not know about the incident. He did not want them to find out. He imagined Katsuki being furious that he had not been told about Ida as he had been for Todoroki, and his mother being upset that he had nearly died. The three of them sat in awkward silence as Midoriya stared at the ceiling. To break the quiet, Midoriya asked Ida if he had learned his lesson. Ida said he had, explaining that he had learned that revenge was not the answer and that he should not act on selfish impulses. Midoriya acknowledged that and more silence fell. When Midoriya tried to sit up and put weight on his leg, he fell back. Todoroki asked what he was doing. Midoriya declared that he was returning to Gran Torino to continue his internship and would not waste time staying in the hospital. Ida protested that Midoriya could barely walk, but Midoriya snapped that no one should tell him what he could or could not do. He went to the bathroom, changed into a pair of jeans and a white t-shirt, steadied himself, and limped back into the room as discreetly as he could. At the front desk, a nurse called after him, and he turned to explain that he had been visiting his classmates who had recently been attacked by the hero killer, Ida Tenya, Todoroki Shoto, and Midoriya Izuku. The nurse thanked him and apologized for their injuries. Midoriya waved and left the hospital. He had 2 more days before he had to return to UA, and he intended to make the most of them. Midoriya thanked Gran Torino and stayed with him for the last few days of his internship. We didn't do that much, but it was better than the hospital. He replied that he didn't think it was anything to thank him for. I thought about it for a moment and admitted that he was probably right, it had mostly been my doing. He glared and warned me not to test him. I laughed, told him goodbye, and started walking away. Torino called after me. I glanced back. He asked how I was in his old man voice. I gave him an annoyed look and began to say my full name, but he interrupted with a blunt no. I protested that it was my name, and he insisted he would remember if it were. I repeated my full name, and he declared it incorrect. I stared at him, sighed, and offered my nickname, Deku. He smiled and walked back into the rundown building. I muttered about old people and their strange farewells as I walked away. I pulled out my phone and watched the latest news report. The reporter announced that Vigilante Deku had taken down the hero killer Stain and had saved 2 heroes in training and pro-hero native. The broadcast said they hadn't been able to reach Deku for comment but thanked him for his actions. I turned off my phone and smiled at the label, Brave Hero. Though I felt anything but brave, I had been terrified. The next day, Kirishima and Shiro laughed at my hair. Katsuki snapped at them and said his hair had gotten used to something and wouldn't go back, threatening in his usual bluster. I laughed and teased his hair back, and Kirishima and Shiro howled with laughter when his hair popped back to its usual state. The others talked about their internships while Katsuki grabbed the collar of my shirt and tried to intimidate me. Denki asked the group if the stories on the news were true, and the class quieted and stared at me. Katsuki demanded clarification about what Denki meant. Denki pressed again, asking if it was true that I had fought the hero killer. I confirmed that I had. Momo said she had been worried because I hadn't answered anybody's texts. I admitted that I had been hoping they might forget if I didn't respond. Sato pointed out that it had been all over the news, so forgetting wasn't an option. Hagakure said it was amazing that I had done what I did. Kirishima then asked who the 2 heroes in training were that I had saved. I glanced toward Todoroki and Ida, and Kirishima reacted in disbelief. Both of them offered slight nods. Ojiro mentioned that he had seen reports connecting Stain to the League of Villains and shuddered at the possibility of Stain appearing at the USJ. Kaminari commented on a video showing Stain's single-mindedness and suggested that, in a strange way, some people found his conviction intriguing. I stared at him and repeated that cool felt like the wrong word, and Kaminari quickly apologized. Class president broke the awkward silence by reflecting that, while some aspects might seem compelling, Stain's choice to harm people remained wrong. Class president raised his voice to start the lesson and told everyone to take their seats. I muttered about how seriously he took that role while Tokoyami complained about the noise. Jiro whispered that Kaminari had started the odd conversation, and Kaminari apologized. Later that day, All Might arrived and announced that he would be teaching. He greeted everyone enthusiastically, saying it had been a long time, and explained that the class would do basic hero training in the form of a rescue training race. Class president asked whether they should go to the USJ for rescue training, but All Might said that disaster training was different and that this exercise would be a race. Behind him was a huge pipe obstacle course, a labyrinth of factories and pipes. I thought the school was really trying to push them to their limits. All Might explained the rules. They would be split into 4 groups of 5 and race from the outskirts of the city to find the source of a distress signal. The first team to find him would win. He also asked everyone to keep damage to a minimum while pointing at Katsuki. Katsuki mumbled that he wasn't the one to point at. I was in the first group. All Might led us into the maze and assigned our starting positions. My opponents were Ojiro, class president, Shiro, and Mina. Shiro looked like the only real threat. Class president was still injured, and Mina and Ojiro's quirks didn't seem especially suited to this kind of course. I told myself not to be cocky and quietly thought I would win. Bakugo's point of view. One of the observers wondered aloud whether Ida should be sitting out because he was injured. The camera showed the faces of the participants in the maze, and I had a cocky grin. Momo suggested that Midoriya might be at a disadvantage, and I thought that idea was ridiculous. Deku could handle himself. Other students predicted various winners. Shiro, Ojiro, Ashido, and a few put their money on Deku. Uraraka thought Ida might pull through despite his injury. All Might shouted start and a horn sounded. The screens showed Siro in the lead, Mina was sliding along the pipes, Ojiro was using his tail. To move efficiently, Ida was running steadily despite his injury, and for a moment Deku was nowhere to be seen. The camera continued to show Siro in first place, but in an instant the title next to his picture changed, and the feed cut to where All Might had been hiding. Deku was standing beside him, wearing a confident smirk. All Might declared Midoriya the winner. I smirked and let the class know that I had told them so. Deku POV. All Might thanked him for saving him and handed him a sash. Deku nodded, took it, and stuffed it into his pocket. All Might then praised the other four, telling them that although Midoriya may have been first, it was clear from the start of the year to now that they had all made incredible improvements and should keep preparing for their final exams. The others answered with a salute. Deku nodded but wasn't really paying attention. All Might called the next group forward. As the others started to head back, Deku was about to follow when All Might called out that he had done a great job and that his performance had been excellent. Deku replied with a modest thanks. All Might then asked to meet after class to talk privately. Deku inwardly groaned at another secret meeting but simply nodded and rejoined the rest of the class. In the locker room, Sato remarked that the training had been tough today as they changed out of their hero outfits. A few students nodded and others began discussing what they still needed to improve. The rest of the races had been interesting to watch. Deku's personal favorite had been when Tsuyu beat Katsuki to All Might at the last minute. The expression on Katsuki's face had been priceless. Mineta then drew attention to a small hidden hole in the wall. The other students reacted, the situation was addressed, and the hole was closed up so it could no longer cause trouble. The group moved on from the incident. Jiro POV. When Mineta drew attention to the hidden hole, Jiro stopped changing and listened. Hagakure asked if anything was wrong, and Jiro said he had heard the commotion. He went to the wall connected to the boys' locker room and put one of her earphone jacks to it to listen. He heard the conversation about the hole and how others were calling it out as wrong. Ida protested, Yaoyorozu insisted they would close it immediately, and the students quickly dealt with the problem. Jiro heard a brief laugh when the situation was resolved and told his classmates what had happened. The others thanked him, but he couldn't help wondering why he had been the only one left out of a particular comment. Deku POV. Todoroki asked where he was going, noting that the bell had rung, as Deku walked out of the classroom toward the place All Might had named for the meeting. Deku explained that he needed to check on something with Nizu for his patrols and that he would see Todoroki tomorrow. Todoroki nodded and walked away. When Deku opened the door, All Might and Mirio were sitting next to each other on a couch. All Might's smaller form startled Deku. Seeing Mirio there reassured him enough not to think he had walked into the wrong room. All Might invited him to sit, and Deku took the chair facing them. Mirio explained that he and All Might had been talking and thought they should tell Deku more about One for All. Deku asked why he needed to know, noting that it was Mirio's quirk and questioning why it concerned him. Mirio began to explain that, based on recent events with the hero killer and the League, Mirio believed Deku might be a target for villains. Deku cut in and said that he had always been targeted by villains. He described himself as a vigilante who had taken down multiple villain groups and accepted that being a target came with that. When Mirio tried to continue and mention a greater threat, All for One, Deku stopped him and stated that he did not want to know any more. He explained that if he learned too much about One for All, he would become a bigger target, and he preferred to leave that fight to them unless it affected him or those he cared about. He emphasized that he was not a hero and wanted to stay out of it. He stood and made his decision clear. All Might said he would respect Deku's wishes if that was how he felt. Mirio nodded in agreement, then stood and expressed his own belief that Deku was a hero in the eyes of Mirio and many others in Japan. Mirio told Deku that if he ever changed his mind, he should not hesitate to come to him, and he held out his hand. Deku took it and shook it, slightly surprised. Deku nodded to both of them and left the room. Deku reflected that he had never heard of All for One before, but the name obviously had some connection to One for All. He sighed, telling himself he did not want to get mixed up in All Might's problems no matter how selfish that sounded. The hero killer had already been bad enough, and Deku had tried to ignore him until a classmate had interfered and dragged him into it. Still, Deku admitted to himself that eventually his curiosity would probably lead him to talk to Mirio. Midoriya thought he had too much on his plate with patrols and final exams to deal with anything else. He decided he would get through the final exams first and only then learn more about the All-for-One Man. Someone told Midoriya that no matter what he said, they thought he was a hero along with the rest of Japan. He insisted he was just a guy taking the law into his own hands, not a hero. Midoriya's point of view. Aizawa closed the classroom door and said unenthusiastically that was all for the day, reminding everyone that they had only another week until the final exams. He told them the written exam was only one part and that there would be a practical portion as well, and then he left. Denki Kaminari and Mina Ashido admitted they had barely taken notes this semester. Their midterm ranks had been 20th and 19th out of 20 respectively. Midoriya shook his head at them, thinking they were both good at hero training but a bit lacking in schoolwork. Mina played it off like it was no big deal while Denki panicked. Fumikage Tokoyami agreed that they had not had much free time, and his midterm rank was 14th. Sato informed Koda that they had barely learned anything when they took their midterms, and Koda agreed. Sato's midterm rank was 12th and Koda's was 11th. Minoru Mineta, who had placed 9th, smirked and claimed everyone would love him, which provoked shocked faces from Mina and Denki. Midoriya sighed and told them that if they wanted to go to the training camp, they would have to find someone to help them catch up. His midterm rank had been 4th. Tenya Ida, as class representative, expressed high hopes that every one of them would make UA proud and revealed his midterm rank was 2nd. Shoto Todoroki noted that it was hard to fail if a student paid attention in class. His midterm rank was 5th. Denki complained about being put down, and Momo Yaoyorozu offered to help with the important topics. Yaoyorozu, who had placed 1st in the midterms, accepted the task but explained that she would not be able to help with the practical training. Midoriya felt bad for her. Her confidence in hero training had gone down since the sports festival even though her quirk had many useful applications. Kyukajiro, who had placed 7th, asked Yaoyorozu for help with quadratic functions. Hantasiro, who had been 17th, said classical Japanese was killing him, and Masahiro Ojiro, 8th in the midterms, asked if there was room for him as well. Yaoyorozu was delighted and declared they would hold a study session at her residence over the weekend. Mina gushed about wanting to see Yaoyorozu's home, and the others listened as Yaoyorozu made plans and promised everyone would be model students by the end. Eijiro Kirishima, 15th in the midterms, smirked and suggested he should be studying with Yaoyorozu. Katsuki Bakugu, who had ranked 3rd, grumbled that perhaps he should beat the lessons into him. Midoriya felt annoyed that Bakugu had placed higher, but he recognized Bakugu's studious work ethic. Yuga Aoyama sighed that everyone was panicking and that it was too late to cram. His midterm rank had been 18th. Mizo Shoji, who had been 12th, advised Aoyama to be more concerned about his performance. Midoriya closed his notebook. He kept everyone's midterm scores written in it, a habit he refused to explain, and rose with the rest of the class to go to lunch. Ochako Uraraka and Tsuyu Azui took seats in front of Midoriya. Uraraka asked if he was worried about the final exam. Midoriya shrugged and said he was not too worried and guessed the written portion would cover material they had already gone over in class. Aizawa had not offered many specifics, and Aizawa's reserve left them unsure. Uraraka expressed disbelief that it would be so simple, and Midoriya clarified that he had never said it would be simple. He was mainly curious about what they would do for the practical portion. Toru Hagakure said the test would cover everything they had learned that year, and Azui agreed. Uraraka guessed it would involve combat, rescue, and the basics. Midoriya began to answer before an elbow struck his face. A blonde, medium-height boy apologized and claimed Midoriya's head was in the way, clearly not knowing who he was addressing. Midoriya looked him up and down and noted that he was from Class 1B. The boy glared and accused Midoriya of being the Vigilante and of having a copying-style quirk, making Midoriya tense at the confrontation. A brief, awkward silence followed as everyone in the area took in the accusation. A student asked about the one who took down the hero killer, and Midoriya answered with a casual "so what?" Monoma launched into a rant about Class 1A always stealing attention, warning that one day the rest of them would get caught in their mess and accusing them of inviting villains and demons. Another Class 1B student stepped in and smacked Monoma, sending him sprawling. Kendo caught the food tray before it hit the floor and scolded Monoma for his remark, reminding everyone she had heard about what happened to Ida. Kendo then turned to Midoriya and the others and apologized for Monoma. Monoma lay limp next to her, which made Midoriya smirk a little. Kendo told them she had heard the practical exam might be similar to the entrance exam, possibly involving robots, and explained she had learned it from an upperclassman. Prez asked where she had heard that, and Kendo admitted it sounded like cheating, but she couldn't help sharing the information. Monoma protested loudly about giving away their advantage, and Midoriya playfully pushed him in response. Kendo nodded at Midoriya and led Monoma off toward their table, telling him they were not the attention seekers as she took him away. Prez scolded Midoriya for hitting another student, and Midoriya explained to Prez that it had just been part of their training. Todoroki, looking up from his bowl for the first time since the conversation had started, asked if that was really part of their training. Midoriya said it was part of the lesson on how to deal with troublemakers. Todoroki stared for a moment, then returned his attention to his food, saying he did not remember that lesson. Later, Mina and Denki cheered loudly, thrilled at the prospect of a practical similar to the entrance exam. Denki admitted he had worried needlessly because if the practical used robots like the entrance exam, they would have an advantage. Mina grinned and echoed his excitement, imagining she could melt robots easily, while Denki celebrated being able to let loose. Shoji asked why they were so happy, noting that both Mina and Denki had trouble controlling their quirks. Shiro suggested they could get help from Yaoyorozu to study and be ready for training camp, and the two classmates celebrated at that idea. Katsuki snapped that it did not matter whether they were robots or people and demanded to know why everyone was so excited. Denki protested when Katsuki called them morons. Katsuki then ordered Denki and Mina to learn control over their quirks and turned his attention to Midoriya, insisting he would not accept another half-hearted win like the one at the festival. Midoriya reacted and pounded his forehead on the desk in frustration, prompting Prez to tell him to stop. Midoriya kept his head down and muttered that he thought they were past the Kaken phase. Katsuki declared that he would settle the score with Todoroki, and Todoroki remained silent, watching him leave and slam the door behind him. Midoriya sighed, got out of his seat, and grabbed his bag. It had been a. Kirishima observed that it had been a while since he'd seen him so worked up. Midoriya told them he was just trying to get everyone riled up as he headed toward the door. Tokoyami asked what Katsuki had against him all of a sudden. Midoriya stopped before opening the door and asked what they meant. Shoji explained that just yesterday during rescue training Katsuki had bet on Midoriya to win, but now he was practically declaring war. Midoriya shrugged and thought Katsuki was impatient, even though he had acted like he was over being pushed out of bounds. It had hurt his pride and he wanted to redeem himself by beating Midoriya at something. Midoriya opened the door and walked out. If Katsuki was going to make this a thing, Midoriya figured he might as well prepare an excuse for why Katsuki would beat him. He intended to pass and go to the training camp. If he wanted to, he could probably take first in the practical and written exams, but that would put him in the spotlight he did not want. Yaoyorozu and Ida had worked hard to be first and second in midterms. If he suddenly ranked higher than both of them, Yaoyorozu might lose confidence and Ida might doubt his role as class representative. He shook his head at the thought as he got on the train home. He found a seat in the back and pulled out his phone, reading more articles about Stain and the League of Villains. He even looked up information on All for One but didn't find anything useful. When the train stopped, he got off and walked the rest of the way home. He called out that he was home and took his shoes off. His mother answered from the kitchen that she was there. He set his bag down and walked in. She asked if he was planning on going out that night. He said he probably would. She frowned and reminded him that Monday was his final exam and he should not push himself. He replied that he had the whole weekend to take it easy and just wanted a short patrol that night to clear his head, and he fiddled with his thumbs as he explained. Ever since the Stain incident, his mother had been reluctant to let him go out, always mentioning his finals. The week he returned, she would not let him go at all. He had to convince her he had only fought to save his friends. Eventually she agreed to let him go for an hour or two, but she would get upset if he stayed any longer. He did not want to make her worry, but being Deku was what kept him going. Saving people had always been his goal, and she knew that. Since attending UA, however, things had become more complicated. Before she had felt bad that he had nothing to do, but now he had school and friends she thought he should spend time with instead of trying to save the world. He was not trying to save the world, he wanted to do what heroes would not. He did not care about money, fame, or the rank he might attain as a hero. I know that's not the thing for all heroes, but it is for a good few nowadays. I didn't care if my quirk wasn't considered suited for something, I would do everything in my power to help someone even if it meant getting hurt. For all I knew there was someone out there who needed me. That thought was why I kept going, no matter how many times I was hurt. People needed me, and that was all I needed to know. Aizawa handed out the remaining written exam papers and announced that their time had started. A half hour into the exam, Katsuki began clicking his pen in boredom and I rolled my eyes. Unknown to him, I had already finished and tried to nap, but his clicking was annoying. I told myself I was going to kick his butt in the practical exam. It was funny to watch Mina and Denki fill out their exams with unusually serious expressions. As Aizawa called time, he told everyone to put their pencils down and instructed the last person in each row to bring the answer sheets to him. Yaoyorozu collected the papers from our row while Mina and Denki thanked her for the study sessions they had. Denki grinned and said he hadn't left anything blank. After 3 days of written exams, only the practical part remained. I leaned back in my chair and stretched. Aizawa announced the beginning of the final test with 7 of the teachers standing behind him. Before coming out for the practical, the students had changed into their hero outfits to make things feel real. Aizawa reminded them that it was possible to fail this exam and warned them not to make stupid decisions if they wanted to go to the training camp. Jiro whispered to the others, asking why all the teachers were present. Niza then popped out from inside Aizawa's scarf and declared that this year's test would be completely different for various reasons. Yaoyorozu asked if they were changing things, and Niza climbed down from Aizawa's scarf to explain that the tests would now focus on hero work and teamwork in combat. He said the students would be paired up to work together against one of their UA teachers and added that the new format was designed to test collaboration. Uraraka reacted in disbelief when she realized they would be fighting the teachers. Aizawa explained that partners and opponents had already been assigned by the administration based on factors like grades, relationships, and fighting styles. He gave an example. Yaoyorozu and Todoroki would team up against him. He also noted that Bakugo, Aoyama, and Uraraka would be a team of 3 facing 13. Nizu called up the rest of the matchups on a screen and announced them in order. The screen displayed the pairings and opponents: Red Riot and Sugarman against Cementos, Froppy and Tsukuyami against Ectoplasm, Tenya and Tailman against Powerloader, Shoto and Creati against Erasure Head, Bakugo, Uravity, and Can't Stop Twinkling against 13, Pinky and Chargebolt against Nizu, Anima and Earphone Jack against Present Mike, Invisible Girl and Tentacle against Snipe, Grape Juice and Cellophane against Midnight, and Deku versus All. Nizu explained that they had 30 minutes to complete the exam and either put a pair of H&D CFFS on their assigned teacher or have one member of the team escape the combat area. Denki summarized that they either had to capture the teacher or run away, and Mina asked if running away was truly allowed. Nizu confirmed that it was. Yamahata warned that this exam would be much harder than previous combat training because they were going up against people far more experienced than the students. 13 advised them to think like villains for the purpose of the exercise, and Snipe added that while students should fight when they believed they could win, there would be times when they were outmatched and needed to retreat. Aizawa emphasized that Todoroki and Ida in particular should understand the stakes. I kept staring at the screen when I saw the last match listed as Deku versus All, wondering whether All meant every teacher, the whole class, or something else entirely. There were too many possibilities and not enough details, and I couldn't help but wonder why Katsuki had been paired with Uraraka and Aoyama instead of being partnered with me. Yamahata grinned and announced that the support course had provided ultra-compressed weights to add half of each student's body weight, giving them an extra challenge. Aizawa explained that the exams would proceed in the order shown on the screen and told those not currently fighting that they could watch or strategize as a team. I protested that I had no team, and the class looked at me with a mixture of pity and amusement. This was going to SCK. With the rules set and the equipment distributed, everyone readied themselves for the first match. Aizawa would likely notice and therefore put Midoriya on his own against multiple opponents, because in the past Midoriya had proven he could fight a pro hero and win, as he did against Endeavor. Deku's perspective. After Aizawa and the other teachers left, everyone else went off with their partners to strategize. Deku headed to the monitoring room to watch the exams. Recovery Girl greeted him and said she had hoped to see him there. Deku asked if she was fighting and walked to stand beside her. Recovery Girl laughed and explained she was present in case things got a little out of hand. Deku nodded. The door opened behind them and Uraraka entered. Deku explained that watching the teachers fight from the monitors was his way of making a plan, learning more about their fighting styles to help with his own exam. Uraraka agreed that was smart and asked whether he should be strategizing with Aoyama and Bakugo instead. Deku said Aoyama was preoccupied and Bakugo had walked away before he could talk to him. Uraraka smiled and said she would try to get inspiration from the other battles first but would let him know if she needed pointers. The monitors announced that Team Red Riot and Sugarman were starting their practical exam, and the match began. The screen showed Kirishima and Sato charging toward Cementos. Deku sighed and admired their ambition, noting that while Cementos could not move much, he compensated by defending and attacking effectively from a single spot. Kirishima and Sato had similar offensive styles, which likely explained their pairing, but Deku thought they were wasting energy trying to break through cement walls instead of going for the source or avoiding the traps. For a while the teamwork looked promising, but they eventually tired from breaking so much cement and lost. The monitor announced that Red Riot and Sugarman had been knocked out and the exam was over. Deku thought Aizawa knew what he was doing. Recovery Girl sighed and stood, saying the first match had already required her attention, then left the monitoring room. Uraraka commented that the match had been one-sided, and Deku agreed. Deku took out his notebook to record what he had observed. He wrote down the first match, Kirishima and Sato versus Cementos fail. He noted that Cementos seemed to have no limit when using his quirk, and that he exploited that endurance by tiring opponents out and trapping them. Deku advised not to waste time fighting the cement walls and instead to target the source or avoid him entirely. He kept the notebook out and planned to take notes on all matches to build a strategy. The next match showed Azui and Tokoyami against Ectoplasm, and Deku recorded a success. He noted that Ectoplasm used clones both defensively and offensively, and when his clones were down he relied on his own combat skills. He could create one giant clone but then could not make others. If contact was necessary, Deku wrote, go for Ectoplasm himself and avoid wasting time on the clones. The following match pitted Present Mike and Ojiro against Power Loader, and Deku noted another success. He observed that Power Loader had an advantage in areas where he could dig and tended to set traps and attack unpredictably from underground. Deku advised checking the area around him in combat. Power Loader would be disadvantaged in a place he could not dig. Next came Todoroki and Yaoyorozu against Erasure Head, and Deku again recorded success. He noted that Erasure Head wore goggles that prevented opponents from knowing when he was using his quirk, and that he used his scarf to capture opponents while carrying weapons to compensate for his lack of an offensive quirk. Because of injuries, he could not use his quirk for long, and Yaoyorozu had exploited that. Deku suggested that, in combat, disabling the goggles would reveal whether he was using his quirk. Uraraka asked how his notes were going as Deku finished writing about the fourth match. Deku asked if her match was next, and she confirmed, asking him to wish her luck before she left the monitoring room. The monitors announced the start of Team Bakugo, Uravity, and Can't Stop Twinkling's practical exam. The match was one-sided at first, with 13 using her quirk to try to capture the 3 students. Deku watched as Katsuki initially tried to go solo, which put him at odds with his teammates, and then ended up clinging to a pole alongside them, each holding on for dear life. Uraraka's perspective. Uraraka struggled on the fence to avoid being drawn into 13's quirk and cursed softly at how close they had been to escaping. 13 stood in front of the exit gate and said there was no way she would let them win easily. The team was trapped and needed a plan. Aoyama tried to get their attention, but Uraraka told him she was thinking. Aoyama asked whether it was because she liked Midoriya, and Uraraka stared at him. An explosion echoed nearby. Bakugo yelled in disbelief and accidentally let go of the pole he had been holding. He began to be pulled toward 13 by the quirk. Uraraka quickly let go of the fence and used her quirk to lift him up, telling her teammates to release and go for 13 and put the HNDCFFS on her when she gave the signal. Seeing Bakugo lifted, 13 stopped using her quirk, and Uraraka pinned her long enough to get out of the way. When she shouted release, Bakugo launched himself back at 13 with an explosion that pinned her, and he slapped the HNDCFFS on her. Aoyama cheered as he grabbed one of 13's arms and declared he had her. Bakugo stood up, rolled his eyes, and claimed that Aoyama had done nothing. Uraraka laughed and noted that Aoyama was nicknamed Twinkle Toes by Deku as well, observing that the two were alike. Bakugo shrugged and walked out through the exit. The monitor announced that Team Bakugo, Uravity, and Can't Stop Twinkling had passed the finals. Deku's perspective. Deku laughed at Katsuki's expression as the buzzer announced their success and wondered what Aoyama had said to make him let go of the pole. Azui entered the monitoring room a few minutes before the match had started, and Deku had found her to be good company. He turned as Present Mike and Yaoyorozu walked into the room. Ida walked over with Yaoyorozu behind and said he was not surprised and was happy for Uraraka and Bakugo. Midoriya nodded and congratulated them, and Azui made an agreeing sound. Present Mike remarked that the praise meant a lot coming from Midoriya and smiled. An automated voice announced the next match and called Team Chargebolt and Pinky to the practical exam. The four watched in silence as Denki and Mina faced Principal Nizu. Match 6, Denki and Mina vs. Principal Nizu failure. Despite Nizu's small, unusual appearance, he gained the upper hand by seizing a crane and destroying the exam site, leaving Denki and Mina no opportunity to fight back and eventually causing them to run out of time. Recovery Girl explained that Principal Nizu had been treated poorly in the past and sometimes sought vengeance, and Nizu laughed as he created chaos. When the buzzer sounded, the automated voice declared that Chargebolt and Pinky had failed due to the time limit. Present Mike noted that they had never even seen Nizu. The doors opened and Uraraka entered, expressing disbelief at how quickly it had ended. Yaoyorozu said Nizu's plan had been flawless, and Uraraka lamented that they had been looking forward to the training camp. Present Mike changed the subject to congratulate Uraraka on passing the exam. Uraraka smiled and complimented the others in return. Azui asked what Aoyama had said to Uraraka and Baku. Uraraka began to respond, then blushed and stopped. Present Mike asked if she was all right, and she insisted that she was fine. The moment passed. The buzzer sounded again and the 7th match began. Midoriya felt sympathy for Jiro and Koda facing Present Mike. Yamahata's powerful voice made the matchup difficult, and even with Jiro's advanced hearing, the screaming made it hard for Koda, whose quirk communicates with animals and who was frightened. After several minutes of shouting, Present Mike ended up covered in bugs, revealing that Koda could communicate with insects as well. Recovery Girl expressed disapproval. Yaoyorozu covered her mouth in surprise, and Midoriya grinned and called the tactic impressive. An automated voice announced that Team Earphone Jack and Anima had passed the finals. Jiro and Koda entered the monitoring room a few minutes after match 8 started. Midoriya ran over and told them their match had been brilliant, the best so far. Jiro was surprised by the praise. Midoriya wondered why everyone kept reacting to his compliments, then turned to Koda and said sincerely that his quirk was amazing. Koda blushed and nodded. Match 8 ended quickly because of Hagikure's invisibility and Shoji's distraction of Snipe. After it ended, Midoriya left the monitoring room and headed back to his exam area, skipping the next match, which he did not want to watch. He waited in front of the entrance for the buzzer. The automated voice announced that Team Grape Juice and Cellophane had passed the finals, and Midoriya was impressed. When his own practical exam was called, Midoriya entered the exam area and took in the fake city. He smiled, put his mask on, and felt like it would be just like old times. Bakugo noticed an automated announcement for all students to come to Exam 10's entrance and wondered why they had to gather when Midoriya's match had been planned against the teachers. He joined the others at the entrance, where Mr. Aizawa stood. Ida asked Aizawa what was happening. Aizawa explained that Midoriya had been watching and taking notes on the teachers' moves, so the original plan to have him face all the teachers had been reconsidered. They had decided instead to have the students try to stop Midoriya. The students' objective was to prevent Midoriya from reaching the gate or prevent him from handcuffing them. Those who had failed could earn extra credit, and those who had passed could earn 2 hours of extra sleep at camp if they succeeded. Participation was voluntary. The buzzer announced the start of the practical exam. The doors opened and the class hesitated until Denki ran in shouting about training camp. Bakugo admitted that he wanted to beat Midoriya rather than just extra sleep. Midoriya heard the shout and paused. He used his telekinesis to lift himself to the top of the tallest building in the fake city and watched the class scatter below. Kirishima called out, and Yaoyorozu suggested splitting up to search. Midoriya watched them divide into groups and thought it was unfair. He wished he could have faced the teachers instead. I didn't want to fight the class. Shoji's voice called out to me from behind. He had used his quirk to locate me. I quickly retrieved a pair of H&D CFFS from my pocket and used my telekinesis to snap them around the floating mouth-like appendage. 1 down, 18 to go. Aizawa had figured out my weakness. I was a good person who didn't want to hurt my classmates. I rolled my eyes. If I wanted to win, I would have to stop seeing them as friends and start seeing them as opponents. The people I needed to worry about most were Jiro and Hagakure now that Shoji was neutralized. I leapt from the rooftop and used my power to soften the fall. Hiding on buildings wasn't a plan. From what I remembered of the other exams, the exit gate was where the teachers had entered. I almost ran that way, but I stopped myself. They must have left someone to guard the gate. I needed a distraction. I pulled my notebook from my pocket, tore several clean pages out, crumpled them, and ignited them. Using telekinesis, I enlarged the flames into 10 blazing orbs and sent them flying in different directions, setting off alarms and creating chaos across the district. Bakugo was standing at the gate, holding a walkie-talkie that Yaoyorozu had likely prepared. Yaoyorozu reported over the radio that Midoriya had set multiple buildings ablaze and requested Bakugo's help. Bakugo muttered that he would be there in a minute and told them to send someone to cover for him. He warned that if I left without facing him he would not be happy, but he was interrupted by Yaoyorozu calling him to hurry. Using his explosions, he rocketed toward the fires. Once Bakugo slipped from view, I eased toward the gate. I froze when I heard his earlier threat echo in my head and stepped. But I turned to the city and told myself it would hurt. I used my telekinesis in a focused, dramatic display to bring several surrounding structures down in a controlled collapse, reducing them to rubble and smoke in a way that would draw attention without gore. Then I ignited my arms and directed controlled flames at the ruined buildings to ensure the distraction held. A few feet away, Mineta stood with a terrified expression, a walkie-talkie clutched in his hand. I grabbed the radio with my telekinesis and snapped a pair of H&D CFFS onto him. I pressed the transmit button and pretended to speak into the device, then reported to Yaoyorozu that I had encountered Mineta and secured him, and that I was waiting at the gate. Within minutes the whole class came running. I searched for Hagakure, found her invisible form by the floating gloves, and used my telekinesis to secure her with H&D CFFS. That made 3 captured. With everyone now aware of my position, Jiro was no longer a threat. I used the broken fragments of buildings around me to create barriers and hurl obstacles in classic, high-energy action style, slowing the class down and forcing them to take cover. A number of students were temporarily pinned or caught under rubble but would be fine after a quick recovery. I counted those incapacitated and found 13 temporarily out of the running. Scanning for the missing 3, I realized Katsuki, Denki, and Tokoyami were not among them. Tokoyami's voice commanded Dark Shadow from the right. I pulled my mask lower and used a burst of light to weaken Dark Shadow, then slipped another pair of H&D CFFS onto the shadowy ally to restrain it. That left only Denki and Katsuki, and I had 10 minutes remaining. I considered simply walking out and ending it. Katsuki's shout announced himself with a stun grenade. I had been expecting him. I closed my eyes against the flash and sensed motion in front of me, reaching out instinctively and grabbing Katsuki's face. He yelled and fired explosions, but I used my free hand to seize his arm, swing him over my shoulder, and bring him down hard enough to render him unconscious in a blunt, non-graphic way. I secured him with H&D CFFS. I checked on him and observed that he was out cold. I assessed the situation, didn't spot Denki, and decided not to pursue him. I walked through the gate, and the buzzer sounded. The loudspeaker announced that Team Deku had passed the practical exam. They had never stood a chance. The exams were finally over and only 4 people had failed the practical portion. Denki, Mina, Sato, and Kirishima were the only ones who did not pass, which meant they could not go to the training camp. The 4 were devastated and Mina was crying. Midoriya tried to calm them, insisting that knowing Aizawa there would be a twist and they would end up going. Shiro shook his head and warned them not to get their hopes up. Denki snapped that the rules were clear and they had failed the practicals, then lunged at Midoriya, reaching toward his face in anger. Midoriya batted his hand away before it could make contact. Kirishima added gloomily that they had even failed a second chance. Midoriya looked confused and asked about the second chance. Kirishima explained that Aizawa had said if they were able to stop Midoriya from winning the exam they would get credit toward their practical. Denki accused Midoriya of blowing everything up, and Midoriya shrugged. Shiro pointed out that it was not Midoriya's fault he had been trying to accomplish the same goal, and that he himself might not get to go either because Mineta had done most of the work in their exam. Midoriya patted Shiro on the shoulder and went to his desk. The classroom door slammed open and Aizawa told them the bell had rung and they should be seated. He walked to his podium and announced that although some of the class had failed the practical exam, everyone would be going to the training camp in the woods after all. His announcement came with that familiar, unsettling grin. Kirishima leapt up with excitement at the last-minute twist, and Mina wiped happy tears. Aizawa explained that no one had failed the written exam and 5 students had failed the practical. He named the affected teams and said the practical had been about observing skills and teamwork. The camp would cover strengthening quirks and collaboration, lessons the failed students needed most. He admitted the earlier implication that some would be left behind had been a calculated deception. Ida shot his hand up and demanded to know if Aizawa was worried about losing the class's trust after fooling them twice. Aizawa said he would take that into consideration but warned the 5 who had failed that camp would be grueling, with extra lessons harder than summer school. The mood changed instantly for those 5. Aizawa dismissed the class and left as the bell rang. Ojiro commented that it was nice everyone would get to go. Ida read the information packet and noted they would be at camp for a whole week. Hagakure, excited, suggested they all go to the mall together since they had the next day off and no more exams. Denki agreed that the class had never hung out together before. Bakugo announced he would not be coming. Kirishima told Midoriya that Bakugo was going, grinning. Later, Midoriya said goodbye to his mother and headed out. His mother asked where he was going after noticing he was in casual clothes instead of his usual vigilante outfit. Midoriya explained Hagakure had suggested a class trip to the mall to get things for camp and added that he did not even know what Hagakure looked like because of her quirk. His mother told him to have fun and be home by 8. Midoriya said he would be back by 8 because Bakugo would drag him to the arcade afterwards. Midoriya met Bakugo at the train stop. Midoriya remarked he was glad Bakugo had changed his mind about coming. Bakugo muttered that Midoriya had talked his ear off. Midoriya teased that Bakugo wanted to hang out with the class, but Bakugo claimed he only wanted to get it over with and then beat Midoriya at the arcade. On the train, Bakugo scrolled through his phone and denied wanting the new All Might figurine Midoriya mentioned, joking instead that he might buy bug spray. They arrived at the mall a few minutes later and found their classmates. Denki called out that Midoriya and Bakugo had arrived. Kirishima patted Bakugo's shoulder and said he had known Bakugo would come. Bakugo waved off the comment, saying he was only there to defeat Midoriya later. Kirishima, as class rep, reminded everyone to set an example for UA and be on their best behavior, watching Mineta pointedly as he spoke. He suggested they split up and meet back at 3. The others agreed and formed groups. Kirishima dragged Bakugo away, leaving Midoriya alone. He could have followed them but did not want to intrude on their friendship. Midoriya wandered through the mall planning to look for a new notebook. His current one was nearly full. As he walked, an arm landed on his shoulder. He told the person that they had 2 seconds to take their arm off. The person said he was a big fan and removed his arm. Midoriya told him it was creepy to put an arm around someone like that. The man apologized insincerely, then grabbed Midoriya by the collar and moved in close, asking if that was better. Midoriya recognized the man as Handyman and acknowledged that they had met before. Midoriya braced for whatever came next in that tense encounter. A brief neutral pause followed as events moved forward. Midoriya recognized Shigaraki's dry hands. Shigaraki tightened his grip on Midoriya's neck and warned that if Midoriya did not answer, something might go wrong. He hauled Midoriya over to a bench and sat him down. Midoriya protested that he did not appreciate being handled and that he would not go anywhere. Shigaraki ordered him to be quiet and asked whether he had fought the hero killer. Midoriya confirmed that he had and said he had thought the hero killer was with Shigaraki. Shigaraki replied that the news painted that picture, but he was frustrated that after the Hosu incident everyone only cared about the hero killer and not the nomis he had sent. He asked Midoriya what the difference was between them. Midoriya glanced at him, surprised that Shigaraki knew his name, and thought that the one thing they had in common was madness. Shigaraki warned him not to test him and threatened to turn him to dust. Midoriya kept his thoughts to himself, noting inwardly that he could probably throw Shigaraki into the wall if he wanted. The threat did not intimidate him. He explained that the hero killer had ideals and wanted to change things, while Shigaraki seemed to hate everything and crave attention. Midoriya said the hero killer had a goal and that Shigaraki's motives made little sense. Shigaraki remained silent with his hand on Midoriya's neck, and Midoriya worried he might have angered him. Midoriya had found the previous night dull. He had begun going to Hosu after the stain incident because of rumors of crime there, but he was discovering that there was little to occupy him, perhaps because villains had noticed him and were avoiding causing trouble while he was around. Earlier that day Mineta and Denki had come to his door asking to go to the pool. Midoriya declined. He preferred not to join them. He texted Prez to say the school pool was open and suggested he invite others. Prez was pleased and said he would tell the others right away. Midoriya smiled at the thought of why Mineta and Denki had come to him first and resolved that they would regret the intrusion. Denki noted that it was no surprise Midoriya had declined as they walked away after he had shut the door on them. Mineta shrugged and said it had been worth a shot. When Denki asked how Mineta had known where Midoriya lived, Mineta only smirked. Denki rolled his eyes and said it did not matter. They pushed on toward the pool. Ida ran toward them from the hall and said he had been wondering when they would show up. They looked around and realized most of the guys from class were already there. Ida explained that Midoriya had given him a heads up that the pool was open and had asked him to gather everyone for endurance training. Mineta exclaimed loudly in surprise. Tfuyu greeted Mineta from across the pool, and Jiro added that she had not known the others would be there. The girls were in the school swimsuits. After a round of training, Mineta complained that Midoriya had foiled their plan. Denki said he had warned them not to bother asking Midoriya. Mineta defended himself, and Denki sighed this was what happened when he tried to team up with Mineta. Ida handed Todoroki a drink and remarked that it had been a good idea to get everyone together. Ida explained that it had actually been Midoriya's suggestion and that he had never expected to become friends with someone like him. Todoroki asked what he meant by that, and Ida clarified that he had been surprised at how their friendship had developed. Ida then chided the other students about their swearing habits, telling them that swearing was not something a hero in training should take pride in. One of the newer students tried to joke and said he was attempting to see things from Ida's point of view, though he could not quite manage it. Ida felt his face grow warm. The same student stood and patted Ida on the shoulder, asking him not to take it personally and expressing a hope that they could become friends. Ida nodded. The student added offhand that the lack of swearing made him uncomfortable, and the group laughed at the memory of Midoriya's first day, when he had made the class laugh easily. Todoroki observed that Midoriya's swearing did not hurt anyone and said that while Midoriya was not perfect, he seemed like a true hero and deserved respect. Midoriya protested that he was not a hero. At that moment Midoriya appeared behind them with his arms crossed. Todoroki asked what he was doing there. Midoriya said it had been his idea to have everyone meet, that he had considered not coming until he got bored, and then proposed a race. Denki jumped up at the suggestion and others agreed. Todoroki asked whether Midoriya was wearing his swimsuit. Midoriya stepped back briefly and prepared himself in the school swimwear, and then the group noticed marks on his legs. Ida asked about those marks, and Midoriya explained that they were from an old rival and laughed it off. Someone nearby shouted in frustration about everyone showing up and getting in the way that day. Midoriya heard the voice and felt awkward when he recognized the person. Midoriya clapped his hands and laid out the rules. Quirks were allowed because they were at school, no sabotaging others, and no destroying property. Bakugo appeared and announced that he was going to beat Midoriya. Midoriya rolled his eyes and reminded Bakugo that he had said the same thing several times and had lost each time. A classmate stepped between them and suggested they settle it with a race. Izuku went home with his eyes stinging from chlorine and water in his ears. Katsuki had used his quirk and stayed dry, so Izuku pushed him in and was pulled under when Katsuki dragged him down as well. It had been a chaotic, splash-filled mess, and Izuku resolved to avoid hanging out with the class again if he could help it. Aizawa had come by and told them to leave because they had passed the designated time. Mineta and Denki had signed up for the pool. At home, Izuku turned on the television while his mother was out running errands. The news covered the USJ incident and the events in Hosu, and they kept replaying footage about his involvement with Stain. Announcements kept calling him a hero for confronting the villain, and Izuku felt his temper flare. He almost threw the remote at the set. He wished people would stop bringing Stain up after a month. It still dominated the broadcasts. He sighed and headed to his room to pack for the training camp. His backpack had plenty of pockets. He tipped it upside down on the bed and dumped its contents. School books, papers, and pencils spilled out. He set the books and pencils aside, opened his closet, and searched for clothes. He did not own much. He rarely went out unless he was doing vigilante work, so there had been little reason to dress up. Most days he wore whatever he slept in. He had only a t-shirt labeled t-shirt, and 2 pairs of shorts that could pass for workout gear. This would not be enough. He wore a dark green shirt and light gray jeans as his going out outfit, and a black sweatshirt for colder days. He packed a pair of pajama pants, the plain t-shirt, and decided to add 2 more shirts and a pair of sweatpants before he would be ready. He left a brief note in the kitchen for his mother saying he had gone out to get clothes and took some cash he had taken from villains to cover any purchases. Going to the mall turned out to be the right choice. Last time he had been interrupted. This time he returned with 2 shirts, a new sweatshirt, shorts, sweatpants, and a new notebook, with some money left over. Best of all, no hand-obsessed villain had interrupted him. When he walked in the door, his mother greeted him and noticed the bags. He explained that the clothes were for the camp. She joked about him buying another shirt that said t-shirt, and he produced the sweatshirt he had bought, pleased to point out that it was a sweatshirt labeled sweatshirt. She shook her head and smiled as he carried the bags to his room. He packed the shirts, shorts, sweatpants, the notebook, socks, a toothbrush, toothpaste, and other basic items into his bag. His mother reminded him that training camp started the next day and insisted he go to bed early so he would be ready. They exchanged a brief argument about his plans for the evening before he conceded and agreed not to go out. The next morning, Aizawa announced that the bus would stop for a break and told everyone to leave their belongings and disembark. The group stepped off the bus together and found themselves in a remote spot parked on a cliff, with a railing in front of a wide expanse of trees. 2 figures stood near the edge. Aizawa led the class forward to introduce them. Izuku recognized the visiting heroes as members of the Wild Pussycats. He had heard a little about the team, enough to know some of their achievements and fighting styles. Mineta was already running around, loudly insisting he needed to use the restroom. Aizawa introduced the guests, and the class responded with a chorus of greetings. Mandalay smiled and pointed out over the cliff to the wooded area below, explaining that the land belonged to them and that the camp the students would stay at was in the trees. When one of the students asked why they had stopped up on the cliff instead of going straight to the camp, Mandalay only smiled and suggested they knew why. Unease rippled through the group. Siro backed away, claiming he had left something on the bus, and Kirishima shouted for everyone to save themselves as the class suddenly bolted back toward the bus. Izuku remained where he was and watched his classmates run. It's no use to run with Pixie Bob's quirk. The ground shook and the class was caught up in an avalanche created by Pixie Bob. Midoriya used telekinesis to stay aloft while the rest of the class fell. Pixie Bob commented that she liked this one as Mandalay and Aizawa stared at Midoriya. Aizawa sighed as his hair began to levitate and muttered an expletive. Ida helped Midoriya up and asked what had happened as Midoriya brushed dirt from his shirt. Midoriya explained that Aizawa had erased his quirk, and that he had redirected himself into a tree at the last moment to soften the fall. Kaminari asked what they should do next, and Kirishima shrugged and suggested finding the camp. A high-pitched scream came from behind them. Mineta was facing a huge earth monster. Midoriya said that he hated Pixie Bob's quirk and used telekinesis to grab Mineta. Kaminari and Zero panicked and warned that they were all going to die. Kuda tried to use his quirk on the monster, and Midoriya admired Kuda's effort but recognized that the creature was not an ordinary animal. Midoriya released his hold on Mineta, and Mineta fell to the ground and scolded Midoriya for not warning him. Midoriya glanced at the class. He believed they could handle the situation and felt too tired from staying up the night before to stay longer. He judged that Pixie Bob had full control over the earth creature and that it was only an obstacle. While everyone else focused on the monster, Midoriya walked off toward the camp. On the way, Midoriya encountered a few other hidden monsters in the woods and dealt with them to make up for leaving the class. Mandalay noted that he was early as he walked into camp and asked where everyone else was. Midoriya shrugged and said he worked better alone. When Mandalay expressed surprise that he had left the others, Midoriya explained that he had handled the remaining monsters for them and that they were just slow. Todoroki observed the class searching for Midoriya. Kirishima asked where he was, and the group stopped to look around. Mineta theorized that the monster had eaten him, but Ida pointed out that the pro-heroes had control of the monsters and would not allow a student to be eaten. Bakugo assumed Midoriya had abandoned them, and Uraraka asked why he would do that. Midoriya himself thought it was probably because the others slowed him down. The class fell quiet as Kaminari voiced uncertainty about whether Midoriya would really do that. Bakugo laughed dryly and claimed Midoriya was likely already at the camp, and the rest of the walk passed in silence. Mandalay welcomed everyone into the clearing and mentioned that they had arrived sooner than expected. Bakugo demanded to know where Midoriya was, and Mandalay asked who he meant. Bakugo rolled his eyes and behaved rudely, prompting Ida to scold him for swearing at a pro-hero and then apologized to Mandalay. Uraraka asked again about Midoriya, and Mandalay said that Midoriya had arrived a long time ago. Aizawa walked toward the group and told them that they should be thanking Midoriya. Without his taking out all the dirt monsters, it would have taken them another hour or two to get there. Denki asked for confirmation that Midoriya had dealt with all the monsters, and Mandalay explained that Midoriya had done it as an apology for leaving them and that he was currently sleeping. Mandalay invited everyone inside to get dinner ready. The class cheered about the food and ran into the building. The class was surprised and impressed that Midoriya had taken care of all those creatures and still arrived before them. They considered him relentless. Katsuki shoved Midoriya off the couch, demanding that he get up with brusque words. Midoriya rubbed sleep from his eyes and asked why he had been pushed. Katsuki blamed Midoriya for leaving the class and insisted that the extras were slow, though he added that he did not go off to play hero himself. Midoriya laughed dryly and reminded Katsuki that the point of the trip was to practice hero work. Katsuki stared at him for a long moment before sighing and walking away. Midoriya reflected that he had gone to some effort to make things up. Midoriya resolved to act as if he had not been gone for 2 months and to continue on. Midoriya woke up resentful of the early hour and wished he could return to the days when he slept past noon and stayed up until dawn. He noticed Katsuki already up and stretching and rolled his eyes. Katsuki maintained a strict night routine and rose at an ungodly hour, which grated on Midoriya. Katsuki muttered about basic hygiene, and Midoriya could not face him or anything else, so he rolled onto his side and tried to go back to sleep. Some of the others complained that they should not do what was planned, and a few made harsh remarks about Midoriya. One tired voice offered an extra hour of sleep to anyone who got something on camera, which sparked excited chatter. Midoriya closed his eyes against the noise and prepared for the day ahead. Someone warned that they would wake him, and things quieted down with the occasional giggle. Midoriya kept his eyes closed and ignored whatever was happening. The giggles grew more frequent and footsteps approached. A drop of water landed on his nose. A voice complained that the bucket was nearly overflowing and mentioned Bakugo. Midoriya opened one eye in time to see Katsuki standing over him with a large bucket of water raised. Midoriya used his telekinesis to lift the bucket behind Katsuki, causing the water to splash over everyone nearby, including Katsuki himself. He sat up and greeted the drenched class, pretending not to notice. Aizawa glared at Midoriya and demanded, through gritted teeth, if he had any idea what time it was. Midoriya glanced at the clock and noted it was 6. Aizawa reminded him that he had been supposed to be up by 4:30 and ordered him to get up. Midoriya rose, stretched, and smiled at the class, asking if he had missed anything. Todoroki noted Midoriya walking toward the bathroom. Bakugo muttered that he was going to make Midoriya pay. Kaminari complained about having to change clothes again, and a few others went to retrieve dry clothes. Kirishima remarked at how quickly Midoriya had pulled off the trick, and Siro showed the video on his phone, pointing out that Midoriya had not flinched. Todoroki wondered why the class had thought a prank on Midoriya was a good idea. They should not have been surprised when it did not go as planned. Midoriya returned a few minutes later in sweatpants and a shirt labeled T-shirt. He asked Todoroki what he had missed while pulling shoes from his bag. Todoroki thought back to the earlier hours of grueling training and told him it had been a little disappointing. Midoriya acknowledged that response and laughed, noting that Ito was upset he had slept in. Mr. Aizawa called the class back to training, and Midoriya followed Todoroki outside to continue quirk training. After training, Midoriya grumbled that Todoroki had been an idiot, and Todoroki allowed himself a small smirk as he watched Midoriya walk away muttering. Like the rest of the class, Todoroki was annoyed that Midoriya had been allowed to sleep in. Later, Mandalay called out, wondering if anyone had seen Koda. After another day of training, the students had been told to make their own food. The class was too busy arguing over how to start a fire to hear Mandalay's concern. Midoriya offered to look for Koda, and Mandalay thanked him, pointing him toward one of the mountains. She explained that Koda liked to hide there to be alone, and since it was getting late and he had not eaten, she wanted someone to fetch him. Midoriya headed up the mountain and followed small footsteps that led to a flat spot where Koda stood looking down at the camp. Midoriya commented that he was impressed Koda had climbed up so quickly. Koda jumped and glared, asking how Midoriya had found him. Midoriya said he had followed the footsteps, leaving out that Mandalay had pointed the way. Koda snapped at him to go away. Midoriya warned that it was late to be out there. Koda told him to leave and accused Midoriya and the other trainees of being nosy. Midoriya relayed Mandalay's request that Koda come down for dinner. Koda's eyes widened when Midoriya mentioned the water hose heroes, and he scowled, accusing Mandalay of telling him. Midoriya said he had not been told anything but suspected the water hose heroes were Koda's parents. Koda told him to shut up and turned back to the camp. Midoriya sighed and told Koda that curry was being made at camp if he got hungry. As he turned to leave, Koda called out that he hated Midoriya and his quirk, that the trainee heroes were all training for a foolish dream, and that they would end up destroying each other. Midoriya stopped and faced him, agreeing that the world was messed up and that it was sad a child Koda's age had figured that out, but that he would have to accept it. The narrator told Koda that with the power society had, there would always be villains and bad people, but there would also be people willing to risk their lives to stop them. The narrator acknowledged that losing his parents had been unfair and that Koda had every right to be upset, but warned that isolating himself would only make things worse. Koda remained silent and looked down. The narrator turned to head back to camp and said they better hear he came back at a decent hour. When the narrator returned to camp, Todoroki asked where they had gone. The narrator explained that Mandalay had wanted them to find Koda, so they had gone out to try to convince him to come back. Todoroki asked if it had worked. The narrator said it had not. The kid did not want anything to do with them and was keeping his distance. Todoroki reminded everyone that Mr. Aizawa had scheduled more exercise later and told the narrator to be ready. The narrator complained about more training and took a seat at one of the picnic tables. Todoroki mentioned that the exercise was supposed to be a fun type of activity. The narrator grumbled that whatever it was cutting into sleeping hours. Aizawa announced that now that everyone was done eating, it was time to start the activity. Mina shouted that it would be a test of courage. Aizawa sighed and told the kids in the extra lessons group that they would have to come with him for more training. He ended up dragging Mina, Denki, Siro, Kirishima, and Sada back toward camp while the rest watched them go. The PP Cats then began to explain the rules of the game. It would be a scary maze with Class 1B providing the scares and Class 1A going through the maze trying not to freak out. After all of Class 1A had gone through, the classes would switch. The class was split into teams of 2, but because of the odd number, one person ended up alone. The narrator was annoyed until noticing the look on Bakugu's face when he was paired with Todoroki. Group 5 was called in, and the next few minutes passed with waiting and the occasional scream. The narrator started to find the noises annoying. Looking toward the trees, the narrator noticed black smoke and the smell of something burning and wondered if someone in Class 1B had a fire quirk. The narrator tried to recall who might have a fire quirk from the sports festival and could only think of themselves and Todoroki. There was no way Todoroki would get so scared he would accidentally activate his quirk, and the narrator had not even entered the woods yet. Suddenly, Pishiba began to call out and was pulled toward 2 figures. Mineta cried out that there were villains here and asked why this was happening. The narrator scanned the area and noticed one person missing. The narrator swore under their breath and turned to Mandalay and Tiger, asking if they could handle the 2 attackers. Mandalay protested that they could not let the narrator leave. The narrator snapped that they had not asked for permission and that if the others could hold their own, the narrator would go get the kid who was stuck on a cliff while villains were running around. Tiger started to argue that they could not be spoken to that way, but the narrator said that this conversation was not helping and ran toward Koda's hideout. Mandalay called the narrator's name as they ran. Ida told Mandalay not to worry about the narrator and apologized on the narrator's behalf for the way they had spoken, saying it had not been heroic behavior. Mandalay replied that the narrator was a reckless teen running off into danger. Ojiro pointed out that the narrator had already handled plenty of danger and urged Mandalay to trust that they could handle themselves. Reluctantly, Mandalay nodded and turned to face the villains who had Pishiba. The 2 villains smiled. One was a lizard-like figure with a bandana and weapons on his back. The other held Pishiba under a pole-like weapon. The lizard widened his grin and announced that they were the League of Villains. Mandalay instructed the rest of the students to retreat to camp and told the class representative that they were in charge. She then broadcast instructions to the rest of the class and nearby heroes, warning them about the situation and urging everyone not to engage in combat. Mandalay tried to call Koda directly and told him to get somewhere safe, but the narrator switched perspective as Mandalay's voice echoed into Koda's head and the cloaked person approached. Koda heard Mandalay's warning but could not make out the words as the cloaked figure walked closer. The cloaked person removed his mask, revealing a face with a grin, and offered to trade his mask for Koda's hat. Koda immediately recognized him and reacted with disbelief. The man raised his arm, and a loud blast echoed through the clearing. Koda was knocked off balance as something ran into him. Someone rushed forward to check for injuries and muttered that it hurt before turning to face the villains again. The newcomer from the previous day stood protectively in front of Koda, bristling with anger. He declared his hatred for the way quirks and hero worship had distorted people's lives and lashed out at the idea that aspiring heroes could ignore the harm left in their wake. The situation became chaotic as the villains advanced with loud, stylized movements, and the students and nearby heroes responded in quick, energetic action. Moves flashed through the trees and lights streaked across the clearing in a non-graphic, animated-style clash. Mandalay continued to coordinate, directing classmates to safety while the more experienced heroes engaged the intruders. The narrator pushed on toward Koda's hideout despite the commotion, determined to reach the kid who had isolated himself. A short distance from the hideout, the narrator arrived to find Koda shaken but not severely hurt. The newcomer from the day before kept a watchful stance between them and the villains. Mandalay's broadcast reached them again, calling for everyone to regroup at camp. The narrator told Koda that they would explain everything back at camp and urged him to come along. Koda hesitated for a moment, then nodded. The group moved out together toward the relative safety of the camp, with the heroes coordinating to keep the villains contained until backup arrived. An onlooker scoffed that they were all just going to end up killing each other and called it disgusting. Midoriya wondered why the man was here. One of the rescuers mumbled that Mandalay had not told them much, but they assumed the people involved were his parents. Midoriya told them to be quiet. He wondered why the man cared so much. Midoriya had only made it in time thanks to Mandalay and Tiger. He pressed his hand to his side where it still throbbed from the force of a punch that had already shoved him back. The villain stepped closer and observed that Midoriya had been on the list, at the top if his memory served. Midoriya glanced behind him at Koda. Koda looked past him at the villain, tears streaming down his face. Midoriya reassured Koda that everything would be all right and that he had to trust him. He stood and warned Koda that when he told him to run, he needed to run as if there were no tomorrow. Koda sniffed in response. Midoriya activated his telekinesis and lifted Koda, moving him over the villain and sending him to the other side of the cliff. Midoriya shouted for him to run. From behind the villain, Koda froze, staring in shock. The villain laughed and taunted that the display had been entertaining and promised to take out the child once he was finished with Midoriya. He leapt into the attack. Midoriya tried to block, but the force of the blows sent shock through him and left him reeling. He used a burst of smoke to blind the villain briefly, forcing him to stagger back as he wiped his eyes. While the villain struggled, Midoriya gathered rubble with telekinesis and hurled it at him. The villain staggered and grinned, asking if Midoriya wanted to continue. In an instant he closed the distance and struck Midoriya in the stomach. He challenged Midoriya, and Midoriya found himself pushed into the cave and to the ground, every movement painful. He tried to stand and fell under his own weight, crying out in frustration. The villain mocked him for being weak and jeered at his earlier promise that everything would be all right. The taunt stung, but Midoriya forced himself upright. He ignited flames along his arms and aimed them at the villain, who commented on the manifestation of his quirk while dodging. Midoriya focused his telekinesis on a boulder and threw it from behind. It hit the villain, who brushed it off as if unhurt. The strain of using both quirks left Midoriya lightheaded and dizzy. The villain told him to be honest with himself and insisted he was not saving anyone. The villain readied another blow, but stopped when he saw Koda holding rocks in his hands. Koda cried out, demanding the villain leave him alone. Midoriya feared Koda was putting himself in danger. Midoriya steadied himself. Sparks danced around him and the flames along his arms flickered as he launched another barrage toward the villain despite the burning in his throat. He lifted a massive boulder again and dropped it toward the villain. The villain punched it aside and sent a rock flying back at Midoriya, knocking the wind out of him and forcing his fire to extinguish. Smoke trickled from Midoriya's mouth as he ignored the pain and surveyed the fallen debris. He felt exhausted and was on the verge of collapsing. He lifted every major rock and focused all his strength into dropping them with crushing force. The impact rattled the cavern. The villain went down. Midoriya used telekinesis to lift him and hurl him into the cave wall. When the dust settled, the villain remained down. Midoriya stared at the motionless figure for a long moment before his legs gave out and he dropped to his hands and knees. Koda watched as Midoriya coughed smoke and tried to staunch a trickle from his nose. He was a mess. Tears blurred his vision, he could barely breathe, his head pounded, and he felt utterly spent. He thought to himself that he was no hero. As he fought to rise and help Koda, Midoriya saw the villain twitch out of the corner of his eye. He felt a sinking hopelessness. The villain rose despite Midoriya's pleas and commented that it had been something. Midoriya moved Koda behind him using telekinesis because the boy had been left too close to the fallen man in the scramble. Koda cried that they needed to go. Midoriya scolded Koda for not running when he had been told to. He did not care if that hurt Koda's feelings. He had had a plan: get the child to safety, land a hit or two, then escape. The plan had fallen apart. The villain straightened and proposed a rematch, asking how a round 2 would sound to Deku. Midoriya braced himself as the confrontation continued. I did not look at him. Ida told me he had seen who I had chosen to intern with and that he was not foolish. Midoriya told me not to be an idiot, acknowledging that I wanted to avenge my brother but insisting there was nothing I could do. I whispered that my brother was paralyzed from the waist down and could no longer be a hero. Midoriya did not reply. I said it was all his fault. Midoriya replied that it was not my place to teach anyone a lesson and that justice would come, just not from a 16-year-old. I forced a laugh, reminded myself that as class president I should not be behaving this way, and thanked Midoriya as I walked away. I asked Midoriya if he should be heading for his train as he walked toward me. He said he had been planning on walking there. When I protested, he shrugged and said he only wanted to remind me not to do anything reckless. I mumbled my thanks. Midoriya told me that we were friends and that I could talk to him if I needed to. I agreed, smiled, and waved before walking toward the train. Midoriya was my friend. I did not always agree with his words or his decisions, but I cared about him, and it was clear he cared about me. They were both right. I should not be trying to get revenge. I lowered my head and apologized. Manuel reassured me that there was no need to apologize and that he understood where I was coming from. I thanked him for telling me about Midoriya. Manuel said it was no problem and urged us to continue patrolling. I knew revenge was not the answer, but I still did not know what to do with the anger inside me. The villain asked how a round 2 sounded. Midoriya replied that it sounded terrible and that he thought they should stop and pick this up again in a few years. The villain ignored him and said he had been playing around, but those last few hits had set him off. The villain admitted the whole fight had been getting to him and that he was done playing and thought he had hit Midoriya too hard. The villain scowled and charged faster than before. Midoriya lifted himself and Koda up before the attack could strike them. Midoriya muttered that the villain was faster now. He glanced toward the camp and considered running to Aizawa for help, but he realized that leading the villain there could expose other people who might be on the villain's list. Tears pricked his eyes from overwhelming frustration. He wished for more power or an ally to turn the tide. The villain accused him of being cowardly and said he had thought Midoriya was braver, even Japan's savior. The villain powered up his quirk and leaped at them. Midoriya quickly pushed Koda out of the way and took the hit. He crashed into the ground and felt the wind knocked out of him. Koda begged Midoriya to stop and to get out of there because nothing was working. Midoriya made an obscene gesture while trying to breathe, and admitted inwardly that he did not care if Koda was a child. Koda was the reason he was in this mess. He stood and put himself between Koda and the villain so the child would be hidden. He needed a plan. Sparks danced around him as he used telekinesis to lift the villain high into the air and then released him. The villain laughed as he landed and cracked the ground, grinning without a scratch. He immediately ran back toward them. Midoriya ordered Koda to run this time and cursed the villain's quirk, which seemed like a twisted version of All Might's power. Midoriya pushed the villain back with telekinesis, but the villain fought against the hold to get closer. The pressure in Midoriya's head pounded. After years of strengthening his quirks and building tolerance, he had reached his limit. His throat burned as he fired ball of flame at the villain while holding him with telekinesis, aiming for the exaggerated muscles in hopes the strain would make him pass out like some engineered foe. After a minute, the burning became unbearable and he had to stop. Dark smoke began to curl from his mouth and nose. The villain seized the moment, broke free of the telekinetic hold, and shoved Midoriya to the ground. Midoriya stopped dodging and simply took the hits. He felt that he could not keep going. As his vision blurred, memories flashed before him. He realized he had taken his life and the people in it for granted. He had believed he could help people and live up to the title of Japan's savior. In that moment he thought of his mother and felt a regretful apology to her. Koda watched and panicked when Midoriya stopped moving. He activated his quirk and blasted the villain with a surge of water, crying out for the villain to leave Midoriya alone. The villain laughed and told the child to wait a little longer, promising violence once he was finished. The ground began to shake as the villain was lifted off Midoriya. A scratchy voice interjected, saying that he would never allow the villain to touch Midoriya after all the suffering he had caused. The villain demanded to know how someone had grown stronger, and then he was lifted away from Midoriya entirely. Midoriya emerged from the rubble and slowly stood, green sparks crackling around him and making him seem to glow. He gasped that a second round was exactly what he needed to finish the fight. In a flash, the villain was sent flying into the cave walls, and debris collapsed around him, trapping him beneath the rubble. Midoriya remembered telling Koda that while trying to save people, Koda's parents had left him behind, and that although he did not understand now, someday he would meet someone who would help him understand, someone who would risk their life to save his. Midoriya thought of that person as a true hero.